The History of Literary Criticism: How Ancient Greeks Hacked Your Brain. Right now, as you read this, you're being manipulated, not by some shadowy government agency or tech company algorithm, though they're doing it too, but by a system of thought so ancient, so deeply embedded in human culture that you've never noticed it's there. It's been shaping what you read, what you watch, what stories make you cry or rage or fall in love. It's been deciding which books become classics and which get forgotten, which authors become immortal and which disappear into obscurity. This system is literary criticism, and it's one of the most successful mind control operations in human history. For 2.5 millennia, a succession of philosophers, priests, academics, and theorists have been telling you what to think about stories, how to interpret them, which ones matter, and why. They've created frameworks that determine what gets published, what gets taught in schools, what gets adapted into movies that make billions of dollars. And here's the disturbing part. It all started with one man who wanted to ban poets from society because he thought they were too dangerous. He failed to ban them, but he succeeded in creating a system of control that's still running today. Every time you argue about whether a book is good or bad, every time you analyze a character's motivations, every time you look for deeper meaning in a story, you're using tools that were forged in ancient Greece and refined over centuries specifically to control how humans think about narrative. This is the story of how that happened. This is the history of literary criticism, the most sophisticated, longest-running campaign to shape human consciousness ever devised. And by the end, you'll see how book talk influencers in 2025 are running the exact same psychological operations that Aristotle invented in 335 BCE. Buckle up. We're about to trace 2,500 years of mind games, manipulation, and the eternal human need to control what stories mean. The Day One Greek almost got all poets executed. Athens, approximately 380 BCE. A man named Plato is sitting in his academy, surrounded by students, and he's proposing something so radical it would horrify every writer, filmmaker, and storyteller today. Poets should be banned from the ideal society. Exiled, kicked out, gone. Not because they're bad at their jobs, because they're too good at them. Plato understood something that most people in his time didn't consciously recognize. Stories have power, dangerous power. The power to make you feel things that override your rational thinking. The power to make you sympathize with people you should condemn. The power to make you question the values society has decided you should hold. And Plato was terrified of that power. To understand why Plato wanted to exile poets, you need to understand what poets were in ancient Greece. They weren't just people who wrote pretty verses. They were the primary educators, the keepers of cultural memory, the moral authorities. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey weren't just entertainment. They were how Greeks learned about honor, courage, loyalty, the relationship between humans and gods. When a Greek child learned to read, they learned from Homer. When Greek soldiers went to war, they thought about Achilles. Plato looked at this situation and saw a problem. Poets were teaching through emotion and imitation, rather than through reason and philosophy. They were showing gods behaving badly. Zeus cheating on his wife, Ares being a coward, Aphrodite manipulating mortals. They were showing heroes making questionable choices. Achilles sulking in his tent while his comrades died, Odysseus lying and cheating his way home. These stories made people sympathize with flawed characters. They made moral ambiguity seem normal. They bypassed rational judgment and went straight to the emotional core of human psychology. In Plato's masterwork, The Republic, he lays out his case against poetry in terms that would sound familiar to any modern media critic worried about violent video games or corrupting television shows. Poetry, Plato argues, is dangerous for three reasons. First, it's mere imitation of reality, twice removed from truth. There's the ideal form of something, say the perfect concept of chair. Then there's the physical chair a carpenter makes, an imitation of the ideal. And then there's the poet's description of the chair, an imitation of an imitation. Poets deal in shadows of shadows, never reaching real truth. Second, poetry appeals to the lowest parts of human nature, the emotional, the passionate, the irrational. It feeds the part of the soul that should be suppressed by reason. When you watch a tragic play and cry, you're indulging emotional weakness. When you read about heroes in battle and feel your blood stir, you're letting passion override judgment. Third, and most dangerous, poetry teaches by bad examples. Homer shows gods lying and heroes murdering guests. Tragic playwrights show good people suffering and bad people prospering. This undermines moral education. If children grow up thinking that even the gods behave immorally, how can you teach them virtue? Plato's solution is radical. In the ideal state, you ban most poetry. You keep only hymns to the gods and praises of good men. Everything else, the exciting stuff, the emotionally powerful stuff, the stories people actually want to hear, gets kicked out. Poets who write it get exiled. It's the first recorded case of censorship for moral protection, and Plato lays out the template that would be used for the next 2,000 years. Stories are dangerous because they bypass reason and manipulate emotion. Therefore, they must be controlled by philosopher guardians who know better than the masses what's good for them. But here's what makes Plato the founding figure of literary criticism rather than just a would-be censor. He takes stories seriously. He doesn't dismiss them as trivial entertainment. He recognizes that narrative has immense psychological power, and he tries to understand how that power works. He analyzes how poetry affects audiences, what makes it persuasive, why it's so seductive. He's the first person in Western literature to ask the questions that literary criticism has been asking ever since. What do stories do to people? How do they work? What makes them powerful? Should that power be controlled? And if so, how? Plato's students weren't stupid. They saw the massive gap between his ideal society, no poets allowed, and actual society, which loved poets and needed them. One student in particular, a young man named Aristotle, thought his teacher had gotten it completely wrong. Aristotle would spend years developing a counter-argument so sophisticated that it's still the foundation of literary criticism today. But before we get to Aristotle's revolutionary response, we need to understand just how radical Plato's position was. He wasn't saying poetry was bad art or poorly written. He was saying it was dangerous to human souls and societal stability. He was saying the most popular, beloved, culturally central art form of his civilization needed to be almost entirely eliminated for the good of humanity. Think about that for a moment. Imagine someone today seriously arguing that we should ban all fiction except religious texts and patriotic stories. Imagine someone saying that Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, The Hunger Games, and everything else that makes moral ambiguity interesting should be illegal because they corrupt youth by showing bad people doing interesting things. That's what Plato proposed. And he proposed it not as some fringe crazy person, but as one of the most respected philosophers in Athens, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. He failed, obviously. Society didn't exile its poets, but Plato succeeded in something more subtle and more lasting. He established that literature needed to be criticized, analyzed, and judged by philosophical standards. He created the idea that stories weren't self-evident, but required expert interpretation to understand their effects and implications. He created the framework that says you can't just enjoy a story. You need someone to tell you what it really means, whether it's good for you, how it's affecting your mind and soul. That framework has been running, with modifications, for 2,500 years. And the first major modification came from Plato's star pupil, who looked at his teacher's anti-poetry stance and said, actually, poetry might be one of the most important things humans do. Let me show you why. Aristotle's secret cheat code that still creates toxic crushes. Aristotle did something revolutionary that we still haven't fully recovered from. He made it respectable to analyze the hell out of stories. More than that, he created a toolkit for understanding why stories work, why they move us, why we keep coming back to them even when they make us cry or terrify us or break our hearts. His book Poetics, written around 335 BCE, is only about 26 pages in most modern translations. It's fragmentary. We've probably lost half of it, including the entire section on comedy. What survives is mainly about tragedy, the form of drama that dominated Greek theater. But those 26 pages created the blueprint for how Western culture has thought about storytelling ever since. Here's what Aristotle figured out that Plato missed. Poetry isn't dangerous because it's irrational. Poetry is actually a form of knowledge, a way of understanding human nature and human experience that's different from philosophy but equally valuable. Instead of teaching through abstract principles, poetry teaches through concrete examples. Instead of telling you what human nature is, it shows you humans in action and lets you figure it out. And that, Aristotle argued, is incredibly useful. Let's start with his most famous concept, catharsis. Plato had worried that tragedy made people too emotional, that it encouraged them to indulge their passions. Aristotle flipped this completely. Tragedy doesn't make you more emotional, he argued. It purges your emotions in a healthy way. When you watch a tragic hero suffer and fall, you experience pity and fear vicariously. You feel these intense emotions in a controlled environment, and then you release them. You leave the theater emotionally cleansed. Think about it in modern terms. Why do people watch horror movies? Why do they read sad books that make them cry? Why do they binge-watch shows about serial killers and drug dealers and morally compromised anti-heroes? Aristotle's answer? Because you need to experience these emotions safely. You need to feel fear without being in actual danger. You need to feel pity without being able to help. You need to experience moral complexity without the responsibility of moral action. Entertainment becomes a form of emotional hygiene. Stories give you a safe space to feel things that would be overwhelming or dangerous in real life. But Aristotle went deeper. He didn't just defend poetry, he reverse-engineered it. He analyzed successful tragedies and figured out their common elements, the techniques that made them work. And in doing so, he created the first screenwriting manual, the first guide to narrative structure, the first systematic analysis of what makes stories compelling. His analysis of plot structure is still taught in every creative writing class. A story needs a beginning, middle, and end. Obvious, right? But nobody had explicitly stated it before. More specifically, a tragedy needs a protagonist who is neither perfectly good nor perfectly bad, but somewhere in between, someone the audience can identify with. Make your hero too perfect and the audience can't relate. Make them too evil and the audience won't care when they suffer. The sweet spot is someone flawed but sympathetic. A hamartia, a tragic flaw or error in judgment that leads to the protagonist's downfall. This isn't just any mistake, it's a flaw that comes from the character's own nature, that feels inevitable in retrospect, even though it wasn't predestined. Oedipus's need to know the truth, Antigone's stubborn pride, Medea's vengeful rage. Peripeteia, a reversal of fortune, where things flip from good to bad or occasionally bad to good. The moment when the protagonist's actions produce the opposite result from what they intended. Anagnorisis, recognition or discovery, where the protagonist realizes the truth about their situation, often recognizing they've caused their own destruction. Oedipus discovering he killed his father and married his mother. Othello realizing Desdemona was innocent. Here's why this matters. Aristotle created a formula, not a restrictive, creativity-killing formula, but an analytical framework that lets you understand why some stories work and others don't. He gave writers a toolkit and audiences a way to articulate what they're feeling. And that formula still runs everything. Every Hollywood movie you've ever watched follows Aristotelian structure, usually without the writers knowing they're doing it. Every romance novel, every mystery, every thriller uses the techniques Aristotle identified. The hero's journey that Joseph Campbell popularized in the 20th century, it's Aristotelian structure with different terminology. But let's talk about what this has to do with toxic relationships, because this is where Aristotle's influence gets really interesting and kind of dark. Aristotle argued that the best tragic heroes are people who are like us, but slightly elevated, better looking, more successful, more intense, not perfect, but impressive. And they should have one major flaw that's actually an excess of virtue. Achilles isn't angry because he's bad, he's angry because he cares so intensely about honor. Antigone isn't stubborn because she's foolish, she's stubborn because she cares passionately about family loyalty and religious duty. Sound familiar? That's every misunderstood bad boy character in romance fiction. That's every brooding anti-hero who's mean because he cares too much. That's every toxic love interest whose controlling behavior gets reframed as he's just protecting you because he loves you so much. Aristotle taught Western culture that the most interesting characters are flawed, and that the most compelling flaws are virtues taken to excess. He taught us to sympathize with characters because of their flaws, not despite them. He taught us that passion and intensity, even when destructive, are more interesting than moderate virtue. And media has been running that program ever since, creating character after character whose toxic traits get romanticized because they're framed as tragic flaws rather than red flags. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights? Aristotelian, tragic hero with an excess of passionate devotion. Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre? Same template. Every vampire boyfriend in modern paranormal romance? Every emotionally unavailable alpha male in contemporary romance. Every he's mean because his past hurt him character in romance novels, movies, TV shows, and now book talk recommendations? They're all running the Aristotelian formula. Take a virtue, loyalty, protectiveness, passion, push it to excess until it becomes a flaw, and make that flaw the source of both the character's appeal and their downfall. Aristotle also gave us the concept of mimesis, imitation of action. He argued that humans have a natural instinct to imitate and to enjoy imitations. This seems simple, but it's actually profound. Why do you enjoy watching actors pretend to be other people? Why do you get invested in characters you know aren't real? Why does fiction affect you even though you know it's made up? Because, Aristotle argued, humans learn through imitation. Children learn by imitating adults, students learn by imitating teachers, and audiences learn about human behavior by watching imitations of human action. Fiction is a learning tool, a way to experience situations you'll never actually face and figure out how humans behave under pressure. This is why you can read about a serial killer and understand their psychology without becoming a serial killer yourself. This is why you can watch a romantic relationship fall apart and learn what not to do without having to destroy your own relationship. This is why fiction is useful beyond mere entertainment. It's simulation. It's practice for life. But here's where Aristotle planted a seed that would grow into massive problems later. He ranked different types of poetry hierarchically. Tragedy was the highest form, dealing with noble characters and serious themes. Comedy was lower, dealing with common people and silly situations. Epic poetry, like Homer, was somewhere in between. This ranking created the template for high versus low culture that persists today. Serious drama is art, comedy is just entertainment. Literary fiction is important, genre fiction is disposable. Films that win Oscars matter, blockbusters are just commercial products. Aristotle didn't mean to create cultural snobbery, but that's what happened. His analytical framework, which was meant to understand why different types of stories work differently, became a value judgment about which types are worth creating and consuming. The other problem with Aristotle, and this is huge, is that he codified the idea that stories should have unity of action, time, and place, though later critics took this more strictly than Aristotle intended. A tragedy should focus on one main action taking place over a short period, ideally a single day, in one location. This sounds like a reasonable guideline for theatrical production. It became a stranglehold on creative freedom for the next 2,000 years, with critics attacking any play that violated these rules as messy, undisciplined, and artistically inferior. Shakespeare would eventually blow these rules apart, but not before generations of playwrights struggled to squeeze their stories into Aristotelian containers. But despite these problems, Aristotle's achievement is monumental. He took poetry seriously without wanting to ban it. He analyzed it systematically without sucking out its emotional power. He created a vocabulary for discussing stories that we still use today: plot, character, theme, catharsis, recognition, reversal. Every time you discuss whether a character's arc is satisfying, you're using Aristotelian concepts. Every time you complain that a movie's plot doesn't make sense, you're applying Aristotelian standards of unity and coherence. Every time you cry at a sad movie and feel better afterward, you're experiencing catharsis. Aristotle gave Western culture the tools to analyze stories, and those tools have been shaping how stories get written and received for 2,300 years. The toxic relationships he helped romanticize, the hierarchies he helped establish, the formulas he helped create, they're all still running, still shaping what gets written and what gets read. And we're only at chapter 2. Wait until you see what the Romans did with Aristotle's toolkit. The Roman who made feels facts the ultimate rule. Enter Horace, Roman poet and literary critic living in the glory days of Augustus Caesar around 20 BCE. Rome has conquered Greece militarily, but Greek culture has conquered Rome intellectually. Roman aristocrats speak Greek, read Greek philosophy, watch Greek plays translated into Latin. And Horace, looking at this cultural borrowing, decides to write a guide for Roman poets that will synthesize Greek literary theory with Roman practical sensibility. The result is Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, a poem of about 476 lines that would shape literary criticism for the next 1,800 years. Horace does something clever that Aristotle didn't. He makes literary criticism about the audience's experience rather than abstract philosophical principles. Aristotle analyzed tragedy from a theoretical perspective, asking what makes it work structurally. Horace asks a different question: what makes audiences like something? And his answer, refined and developed over the course of the poem, revolutionized how Western culture thinks about art. The point of literature is to delight and instruct. Aut prodesse volunt aut delectare poetae. Poets aim either to benefit or to amuse, or to say what is both pleasing and helpful for life. This seems simple. It's actually explosive. What Horace is saying is that pure entertainment isn't enough. Good literature should teach something. But pure instruction isn't enough either. Good literature should be enjoyable. The best literature does both. It teaches you something important while making you enjoy the learning process so much you don't even realize you're being educated. This is the formula behind every successful piece of entertainment today. Every TV show that makes you think while keeping you hooked. Every novel that explores serious themes while being impossible to put down. Every movie that has something to say but packages it in explosions, jokes, and attractive people. Horace didn't invent the concept that art should teach, but he made it respectable to admit that art should also entertain. Greek philosophers had been somewhat suspicious of entertainment. Remember Plato wanting to ban poetry because it was too emotionally engaging. Horace said, no, emotional engagement is good as long as you're also learning something. But here's where it gets manipulative. Horace is basically saying that the best propaganda is the kind that doesn't feel like propaganda. The best way to teach people what to think is to make them enjoy the process so much they don't notice they're being taught. Every piece of media that smuggles political messages into entertainment is using Horace's formula. Every movie that makes you sympathize with a particular worldview while keeping you entertained is running Horace's program. Every novel that shapes your values while being unputdownable is doing exactly what Horace said literature should do. And here's the dark part. This works incredibly well. People don't like being lectured. They don't like didactic moralizing. But they'll happily absorb moral messages if those messages come wrapped in compelling characters, exciting plots, emotional engagement, and satisfying resolutions. Horace understood what modern propaganda experts and marketing executives rediscovered. You can't force people to accept ideas, but you can make them want to accept ideas by associating those ideas with pleasure. Horace also gave critics and writers another tool that would cause centuries of arguments: the concept of decorum. This means that everything in a work should be appropriate to its type and subject matter. Characters should speak and act in ways that fit their social station. Kings should sound like kings. Servants should sound like servants. Tragic heroes should behave heroically. Comic characters should behave absurdly. This sounds reasonable as a stylistic guideline. It became a weapon for enforcing social hierarchies. For the next millennium and a half, critics would attack works for violating decorum whenever they showed common people acting nobly, or aristocrats acting foolishly, or women being smarter than men, or servants speaking eloquently. "That's not decorous" became code for "that challenges the natural social order and therefore is bad art." Shakespeare would violate decorum constantly, mixing comic and tragic elements, having noblemen speak like fools and fools speak wisdom. Critics attacked him for it. But Shakespeare understood something Horace's later followers forgot. Rigid decorum makes for predictable, boring art. Horace also introduced the idea that poetry should be polished, refined, carefully crafted. He compares writing poetry to cutting fingernails and hair, something that requires patience and attention to detail. This seems obvious, but it established a principle that would become important. Good writing is work, not inspiration. This countered the romantic notion, already present in Greek culture, that poets were divinely inspired, that great poetry flowed effortlessly from genius. Horace said no, great poetry is crafted, revised, polished. Genius without craft produces nothing useful. But here's what makes Horace's influence last so long. He's practical rather than philosophical. Aristotle wrote for philosophers and theorists. Horace wrote for actual working poets who needed to know what audiences would accept, what patrons would reward, what would actually succeed in the real world. Horace gives specific advice. Don't start your epic in the middle of the war. Start just before the war begins. Don't make your play more than 5 acts. Don't have more than 3 speaking characters on stage at once. Make sure your meter fits your subject matter. Use different rhythms for different types of poems. Some of this advice is genuinely useful craft guidance. Some of it became rigid rules that stifled creativity. For centuries, critics would attack any work that violated Horatian principles, even when the violations produced better art. The Renaissance would worship Horace, seeing him as the Roman equivalent of Aristotle. French neoclassical critics in the 1600s would treat Horace's guidelines as absolute laws that no proper poet could violate. English critics would debate endlessly about whether contemporary works met Horatian standards of unity, decorum, and polish. But Horace's most lasting contribution is that formula: delight and instruct. Make people feel good while teaching them what to think. This is the template for every piece of effective propaganda, every successful sermon, every educational video that goes viral, every self-help book that sells millions, every political speech that moves audiences. You're being instructed right now while being delighted, hopefully. This entire documentary is using Horace's formula, teaching you literary history while making it engaging enough that you keep watching. The chapter titles are designed to delight. They're provocative, intriguing, promise interesting content. The content is designed to instruct. You're learning the actual history of literary criticism. Horace created the blueprint for how to manipulate audiences into accepting ideas while thinking they're just being entertained. And that blueprint has been running for 2,000 years, getting more sophisticated with every generation, but never fundamentally changing. Modern content creators call it edutainment. Marketing experts call it storytelling. Horace just called it good poetry. And in the next chapter, we'll see what happened when the Christian church got hold of these classical tools and decided to use them for controlling what people read, thought, and believed about everything. Spoiler, they banned a lot of love stories. When the church banned love stories and brainwashed everyone, something strange happened to literary criticism between roughly 400 CE and 1400 CE. The people analyzing literature stopped being philosophers and poets and became priests and monks. The questions changed from "what makes this beautiful" to "is this acceptable to God?" This wasn't a gentle transition. This was the Christian church systematically taking control of literacy, education, and cultural production, and using that control to reshape how Western civilization thought about stories. The early church fathers faced a dilemma. Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire, but Roman culture was deeply pagan. The great classical texts, Homer, Virgil, Ovid, the Greek tragedians, were full of false gods behaving badly, humans defying divine authority, love affairs that violated Christian morality. What should Christians do with this literature? Burn it all? But these texts were also the foundation of education, the shared cultural knowledge that made you an educated person. If you wanted to be a lawyer, doctor, administrator, or teacher, you needed to know classical literature. The solution the church developed was sophisticated and deeply manipulative. They wouldn't ban classical literature outright, mostly, but they would control how it was interpreted. They would teach people to read everything allegorically, finding Christian meanings hidden in pagan texts. This interpretive method, called typology or allegorical reading, worked like this. Nothing means what it appears to mean on the surface. Every story contains hidden spiritual truths that only properly trained readers can discern. The literal meaning is for simple folk. The spiritual meaning is what matters. Want to read Virgil's Aeneid with its pagan gods and questionable morality? No problem, as long as you understand that Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy is actually an allegory for the Christian soul's journey from sin to salvation. The storms represent spiritual trials. The descent into the underworld represents acknowledgement of sin. The founding of Rome represents the establishment of the church. Never mind that Virgil was writing about Roman national mythology and had never heard of Christianity. The church's allegorical method could find Christian meaning in anything. This wasn't just clever reinterpretation, this was thought control. Because once you establish that texts don't mean what they appear to mean, that proper interpretation requires training and authority, you've given yourself power over how everyone reads everything. And the church used that power ruthlessly. St. Augustine, writing in the late 300s and early 400s, created the framework that would dominate literary criticism for 1,000 years. In his On Christian Doctrine, Augustine argues that all knowledge, including classical literature, should be used only insofar as it helps you understand Scripture and serve God. Literature has no value in itself. Its only legitimate purpose is to lead you toward Christian truth. If a story doesn't do that, it's worse than useless. It's actively dangerous to your soul. Augustine distinguishes between enjoying and using. You should enjoy only God. Everything else, including literature, including other people, you should merely use as tools to bring you closer to God. Finding pleasure in stories for their own sake is sinful. Reading for entertainment rather than spiritual edification is wasting time that should be spent in prayer or contemplation. This is a complete inversion of the classical values we've seen so far. Plato worried that poetry was too emotionally powerful, but he valued beauty and art. Aristotle and Horace celebrated the pleasure literature provides. Augustine says pleasure is suspicious, that enjoyment of earthly things distracts from the only legitimate object of love, which is God. And for the next 1,000 years, this becomes the dominant attitude toward literature in Western culture. But Augustine's most insidious move is his theory of signs. He argues that everything in creation is a sign pointing toward God. Words are signs. Objects are signs. Events are signs. Nothing has meaning in itself. Everything gains meaning only through its relationship to divine truth. This gives the church interpretive authority over everything. When you read a text, you can't just understand it on your own. You need church authorities to tell you what it really means, what it's really pointing toward. This is how the church controlled literacy for 1,000 years. They didn't burn most books, though they did burn some. They controlled who could read, who could interpret, and what interpretations were acceptable. The results were predictably restrictive. Romantic love stories? Dangerous because they celebrate earthly passion over spiritual devotion. Adventure stories? Suspicious because they celebrate worldly achievement rather than contempt for the world. Comedies? Frivolous at best, corrupting at worst. The literature that flourished during the medieval period was heavily religious. Lives of saints, biblical commentaries, moral allegories, and devotional poetry. The secular literature that survived did so by cloaking itself in religious symbolism and moral messaging. Dante's Divine Comedy is the perfect example. It's a Christian allegory about the soul's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. But it's also packed with political commentary, personal vendettas, literary criticism, and barely disguised romantic obsession with a woman, Beatrice, who died when she was 24. Dante gets away with this because he frames everything in Christian terms. His journey through the afterlife is presented as a vision granted by God for the moral instruction of humanity. His love for Beatrice becomes love for divine grace. His political opinions become insights into God's plan for proper government. But read between the lines and you see someone desperately trying to write about everything he cares about: politics, love, poetry, revenge, beauty, justice, while navigating church censorship. The medieval church didn't just control what got written, they controlled who could write. Literacy was largely restricted to clergy and aristocracy. Monks in monasteries were the primary copyists, preserving texts by laboriously hand-copying them. This gave them enormous power. They could choose what to preserve and what to let disappear. Guess which texts survived? Religious texts overwhelmingly, classical texts that could be given Christian interpretations, moral instruction, legal documents, historical chronicles written from a Christian perspective. Guess which texts disappeared? Pre-Christian folk stories, pagan religious texts, love poetry that couldn't be allegorized, stories celebrating values the church considered immoral. We've lost vast amounts of classical and early medieval literature because monks decided it wasn't worth copying. The survival of texts wasn't based on literary merit, but on religious acceptability. And the Church enforced this through terror. During the High Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the Church maintained indexes of forbidden books. Own the wrong book, read the wrong text, and you could be accused of heresy. And heresy could get you excommunicated, imprisoned, tortured, or burned at the stake. Knowledge was power, and the Church hoarded that power by controlling who could read and what they could read. But here's the thing about control. The tighter you squeeze, the more things slip through. The very restrictions the Church imposed created hunger for forbidden literature. Underground networks formed to copy and distribute banned texts. Troubadours and minstrels spread stories orally that couldn't be written down. People found ways to code subversive ideas in seemingly religious frameworks. And eventually, technologies emerged that the Church couldn't control. The printing press, vernacular translations, rising literacy rates among merchants and craftspeople who weren't directly under Church authority. The Renaissance was coming, bringing with it a rediscovery of classical texts the Church had tried to control, a celebration of human achievement the Church had tried to suppress, and a literary revolution the Church had tried to prevent. But the damage was done. 1,000 years of Church control had programmed Western culture with specific attitudes toward literature: that it needs moral justification, that pleasure is suspicious, that proper interpretation requires authority, that some texts are dangerous and should be restricted. Those attitudes persist today. Every time someone wants to ban books for being immoral or corrupting youth, they're running the medieval Church's program. Every time someone insists there's only one correct interpretation of a text, they're channeling Augustine's theory of signs. Every time someone dismisses entertainment as frivolous compared to serious literature, they're echoing medieval contempt for worldly pleasure. The Church's millennium of control over literary criticism didn't just affect what people read during the Middle Ages. It created patterns of thought that are still operating in 2025. But first, we need to talk about the revolution that tried to overthrow this system. We need to talk about the Renaissance, when bad boys with printing presses decided that maybe humans were worth celebrating after all. The earthquake that shook medieval thinking. For 8 centuries, medieval critics had maintained an iron grip on what literature could be. Every story, every poem, every dramatic performance had to serve one master: Christian morality. Literature wasn't entertainment or art for its own sake. It was a tool for salvation, a vehicle to teach peasants about heaven and hell, virtue and sin. Beauty was suspicious unless it pointed directly to God. Pleasure in reading was acceptable only if it led to spiritual improvement. The entire medieval worldview treated secular literature like a dangerous drug that needed careful regulation and supervision. Then something happened that changed everything. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, and suddenly Europe was flooded with Greek and Roman manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries. Scholars began reading Aristotle's Poetics, Horace's Ars Poetica, and Plato's Republic in their original languages, and they realized something shocking. The ancient world had developed incredibly sophisticated theories about literature that had nothing to do with Christian salvation. These texts talked about catharsis, mimesis, unity of action, and the psychological effects of tragedy. They analyzed literature as a craft with rules and techniques, not as a moral sermon with characters. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in the 1440s, turned this rediscovery into a cultural explosion. Ideas that would have circulated among a dozen scholars in handwritten manuscripts now spread across Europe in thousands of printed copies. For the first time in history, literary criticism could go viral. Italian humanists in Florence, Rome, and Venice began hosting salons where they debated these ancient texts, and their commentaries were printed and distributed to an audience hungry for new ways of thinking. The Renaissance wasn't just a revival of classical learning, it was a revolution in how people thought about the purpose and power of literature itself. The Italian architects of modern storytelling. Enter Lodovico Castelvetro, a critic whose name you've probably never heard, but whose influence you experience every single time you watch a movie or binge a TV series. Born in 1505, Castelvetro was a literary scholar who became obsessed with Aristotle's Poetics, and in 1570 he published a commentary that would define European drama for the next 3 centuries. Castelvetro did something audacious. He took Aristotle's vague suggestions about unity and crystallized them into the 3 unities, rigid rules that said every play must take place in one location, within one day, and follow one main plot. Aristotle had mentioned unity of action as important, but Castelvetro turned it into a straitjacket. Why did this matter? Because Castelvetro believed ordinary audiences were stupid. He genuinely argued that common people couldn't follow complex plots with multiple locations or time jumps, that they needed simple, linear narratives they could understand without thinking too hard. This was literary criticism as social engineering, using aesthetic rules to control what stories could be told and how. French neoclassical critics loved this because it gave them ammunition to attack Shakespeare and English drama as barbaric and unsophisticated. The French Academy made the 3 unities official doctrine, and anyone who violated them was considered an amateur. But here's the twist that makes this absolutely fascinating. Shakespeare never followed these rules, and he became the greatest dramatist in history anyway. While French critics were obsessing over unity of time and place, Shakespeare was writing plays that jumped across years and continents, that mixed tragedy and comedy, that broke every rule Castelvetro invented. The Tempest takes place in a few hours on one island, sure, but Macbeth spans years in multiple locations, and The Winter's Tale literally has a stage direction that says "exit pursued by a bear" before jumping 16 years into the future. Shakespeare proved that genius doesn't need permission from critics. Yet, the Renaissance critics weren't wrong about everything. Torquato Tasso, the Italian poet who wrote Jerusalem Delivered, engaged in fascinating critical debates about whether Christian subject matter could achieve the same artistic heights as classical mythology. He argued that modern literature needed to find its own voice rather than just imitating ancient models. Julius Caesar Scaliger wrote the Poetics in 1561, a massive 7-volume work that classified every type of literary device and figure of speech, creating a taxonomy that students still learn today when they study metaphor, simile, and allegory. These critics were building a vocabulary for talking about literature as craft, not just moral content. England's response when criticism got personal. The Renaissance Revolution hit England later but harder. Philip Sidney wrote The Defense of Poesy in 1579, and it's one of the most passionate pieces of literary criticism ever written. Sidney was responding to Puritan critics who wanted to ban all fiction as lies and poetry as frivolous distraction from scripture. His defense is brilliant. He argues that poetry doesn't claim to be literally true, so it can't be lying. Instead, poetry teaches virtue more effectively than philosophy or history because it shows you living examples of good and bad behavior. You don't just learn that courage is good, you watch Achilles embody it, you feel it in your gut. Sidney understood something modern neuroscience would later confirm: stories change our brains in ways that abstract argument cannot. But Sidney also revealed the class anxiety bubbling under Renaissance criticism. He spent considerable time defending poetry against accusations that it was effeminate, wasteful, and corrupting to young men who should be studying law or theology instead. The very fact that he had to write this defense shows that literature was under attack from multiple directions. Religious fundamentalists thought it was sinful, practical businessmen thought it was useless, and traditional scholars thought it was inferior to philosophy. Sidney had to argue that literature deserved to exist at all, that it wasn't just acceptable but actually superior to other forms of knowledge. Ben Jonson took a different approach entirely. He was a practicing playwright who also wrote criticism, and he used his critical writings to wage war against his rivals. Jonson loved the classical rules and despised Shakespeare's casual attitude toward them. In his commonplace book Timber, Jonson praised Shakespeare's natural genius, but then immediately complained that Shakespeare never blotted out a line, that he wrote too easily and needed more revision. This was criticism as professional jealousy, the anxiety of a craftsman who followed all the rules, watching someone else break them all and still win. Jonson represents the eternal tension in criticism between respect for tradition and recognition of revolutionary talent. The hidden revolution in how we read. What the Renaissance critics really accomplished was changing the fundamental question literature had to answer. Medieval critics asked, "Does this text serve God?" Renaissance critics asked, "Does this text achieve artistic excellence?" That shift seems small, but it's actually revolutionary. It means literature now had value independent of its moral content. A play could be great even if it depicted sinful behavior, as long as it did so with skill and beauty. This opened the door for moral ambiguity in literature, for complex characters who weren't simply good or evil, for tragedies that questioned divine justice rather than affirming it. The Renaissance also invented the idea of the secular literary canon. Before this period, the only texts considered essential reading were religious: the Bible, lives of saints, theological commentaries. Renaissance critics created lists of great works from classical antiquity that educated people needed to know: Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Horace. They argued these pagan texts were valuable for their artistic achievement, even though they contradicted Christian theology. This was intellectual rebellion disguised as scholarship, and it worked because critics could claim they were just recovering ancient wisdom, not challenging current religious authority. Perhaps most importantly, Renaissance critics established the idea that literature should be difficult and require expert interpretation. Medieval literature was often designed to be accessible to illiterate audiences through visual imagery and simple narratives.
Renaissance humanists, by contrast, prized complexity, illusion, and classical references that only educated readers would catch.
This made criticism necessary because ordinary readers needed guides to unlock the meaning of sophisticated texts. The critic became a cultural gatekeeper, someone whose expertise gave them power to determine what counted as great literature and what didn't. Why this still controls everything you watch. Here's the mind-blowing part. Hollywood still runs on Renaissance formulas. The three-act structure that every screenwriting book teaches, that's Aristotelian poetics filtered through Renaissance interpretation. The idea that stories need unity of action, that every scene should advance the main plot, straight from Castelvetro. The insistence that characters need clear motivations and consistent personalities, Renaissance critics invented that. Even the concept of suspension of disbelief, the idea that audiences will accept impossible premises if the story follows its own internal logic, that comes from Renaissance debates about how fiction relates to truth. Modern franchises are living examples of Renaissance critical principles. Marvel movies follow unity of action religiously. Each film focuses on one main conflict, even when multiple heroes appear. Prestige television has rediscovered Renaissance debates about whether episodic stories or tightly plotted narratives are superior. Critics today who complain about plot holes or unrealistic character behavior are applying standards that Renaissance humanists developed 400 years ago. The Renaissance didn't just influence modern storytelling, it programmed the algorithms we use to judge whether stories work or fail. But the Renaissance also bequeathed us the toxic idea that popular entertainment is inferior to high art. When Italian critics sniffed at commedia dell'arte as lowbrow compared to neoclassical tragedy, they started a war between popular and elite culture that still rages. When they insisted that following classical rules proved sophistication while breaking them proved ignorance, they created the template for every pretentious film critic who dismisses blockbusters as mindless. The Renaissance gave us tools to analyze literature brilliantly, but it also gave us weapons to use art as a class marker, a way to prove you're educated and refined because you appreciate difficult, rule-following literature while the masses enjoy simple entertainment. Shakespeare's genius was recognizing that you could steal all the Renaissance tools, ignore all the Renaissance rules, and create something entirely new. He read the critics, learned the techniques, and then did whatever worked for his audience. That's the real lesson of Renaissance criticism. The theories are useful, the rules are optional, and genius happens when someone understands both well enough to know when to break them. The earthquake of feeling. The early 1700s inherited a worldview from the Renaissance that was all about reason, order, and classical restraint. Neoclassical critics dominated Europe, insisting that literature should be balanced, decorous, and controlled. Strong emotions were vulgar and excessive. Tragedy should purge dangerous passions through catharsis. Comedy should mock social vices with wit, and both should follow established rules. Alexander Pope wrote poetry in perfect heroic couplets where every rhyme clicked into place like mathematical precision. Samuel Johnson compiled dictionaries and wrote criticism that valued moral instruction and intellectual clarity above all else. This was literature as a rational enterprise, appealing to the mind rather than the heart. Then something extraordinary happened around mid-century. Readers started demanding books that made them feel rather than think. Samuel Richardson published Pamela in 1740, a novel about a servant girl resisting her employer's sexual advances, written entirely in letters. It was melodramatic, morally simplistic, and emotionally manipulative, and people lost their minds over it.
Reports from the time describe readers sobbing openly in public, interrupting their daily activities to read just one more letter, church bells ringing in English villages when Pamela finally married her reformed seducer. This wasn't just popular entertainment, it was a psychological epidemic. Richardson followed up with Clarissa in 1748, a million-word tragic novel about a virtuous woman raped by a libertine and dying slowly over hundreds of pages. People read it obsessively, treating Clarissa like a real person whose suffering demanded their emotional engagement. Critics began theorizing why these novels had such powerful effects. They developed the concept of sensibility, the idea that refined souls were more sensitive to emotional stimuli, that your capacity to feel sympathy for fictional characters proved your moral superiority. If you could read about Clarissa's suffering without crying, there was something wrong with you. You lacked sensibility. This was a complete inversion of earlier critical values. Neoclassical critics had praised emotional restraint and intellectual distance. Now critics were celebrating emotional excess and personal identification with characters. The new ideal reader wasn't someone who analyzed literature coolly and judged it against classical standards. The ideal reader was someone who became so absorbed in the story that they forgot it was fiction, who cried real tears over imaginary suffering, whose sensibility was so refined that literature affected them physically. The critics who made feelings respectable. David Hume, primarily known as a philosopher, wrote essays on taste and criticism that revolutionized how people thought about aesthetic judgment. Hume argued that our emotional responses to art aren't just subjective whims, but refined sentiments that can be educated and improved. A person with cultivated taste will have better, more nuanced emotional reactions to literature than an uncultivated person. This made criticism into a kind of emotional education, training readers to feel the right things in the right ways. Hume's standard of taste wasn't about following classical rules, but about developing delicacy of sentiment through wide reading and experience. Edmund Burke took this further in his philosophical enquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful in 1757, which became one of the most influential works of aesthetic theory ever written. Burke argued that literature and art work on us through two primary modes: the beautiful, which produces feelings of pleasure, love, and social affection, and the sublime, which produces feelings of terror, awe, and self-preservation. The sublime was Burke's revolutionary contribution. He claimed that we take pleasure in being terrified and overwhelmed as long as we're safe. Reading about terrible things, experiencing vicarious danger and suffering, actually feels good because it stimulates our survival instincts without real risk. This explained why tragic literature was so popular. Burke argued that we're drawn to tragedy not because it teaches moral lessons, but because it gives us safe access to powerful negative emotions. Watching a character suffer triggers our sympathy and makes us feel our own capacity for feeling.
This was criticism as psychology, analyzing the mechanical processes by which literature affects our nervous systems. Burke's theories influenced Gothic literature, Romantic poetry, and eventually modern horror films. Every time you watch a scary movie and enjoy being frightened, you're experiencing what Burke theorized in 1757. The novel becomes the critical battleground. The rise of the novel created massive anxiety among traditional critics. Novels were new, they didn't have classical precedents like epic poetry or tragedy, they were written in prose rather than verse, and they were wildly popular with middle-class readers, especially women. Establishment critics worried that novels were dangerous precisely because they were so emotionally engaging. Young women reading novels might confuse fiction with reality, develop unrealistic expectations about romance, and become morally corrupted by identifying with characters who violated social norms.
Samuel Johnson embodied this anxiety beautifully. He was a defender of classical standards who nevertheless recognized that literature was changing. In his Rambler essays from the 1750s, Johnson worried that realistic novels were more dangerous than old romances, precisely because they were more believable. When romances featured knights and dragons, readers knew it was fantasy. But when novels depicted ordinary people in familiar situations, readers might imitate bad behavior thinking it was realistic. Johnson demanded that novelists present clear moral lessons, that virtue always be rewarded and vice punished, because otherwise fiction would teach the wrong lessons. Yet Johnson also wrote beautiful criticisms celebrating emotional power in literature. His essay on Shakespeare praised the playwright's ability to create characters who felt universally human, whose passions transcended their specific historical moment. Johnson's criticism of King Lear focuses on how unbearably painful the ending is, how it violates our moral expectations that good should be rewarded. He admits that he himself avoided rereading the play for years because it hurt too much. This was a neoclassical critic confessing that emotional impact could override rational judgment, that sometimes literature affects us in ways we can't control or analyze away. Sensibility goes global. The cult of sensibility spread across Europe with fascinating variations. In Germany, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing wrote Hamburg Dramaturgy in the 1760s, analyzing theatrical performances and developing a theory of tragedy based on emotional identification. Lessing argued that Aristotle's catharsis worked through sympathy. We watch characters suffer and feel their pain, which purges our own emotions. He criticized French neoclassical tragedy for being too formal and distant, for preventing audiences from truly identifying with characters. Lessing wanted theater that broke your heart, that made you forget you were watching actors and feel like you were experiencing real events. Jean-Jacques Rousseau took sensibility to its logical extreme in his novel Julie or The New Heloise in 1761, which became perhaps the most popular novel of the 18th century. It's an epistolary novel about impossible love, social barriers, and moral virtue. Written in language so emotionally intense it feels like reading someone's diary during a nervous breakdown. Rousseau's preface claimed that sensitive souls would love the book, while cold hearts would hate it, turning literary taste into a test of moral character. He positioned himself as the champion of authentic feeling against the artificial politeness of aristocratic society. Rousseau also wrote critical essays, arguing that literature had become corrupt and corrupting, that civilization itself was a mistake that separated humans from natural emotions. This was criticism as cultural warfare, attacking the entire edifice of polite letters from Enlightenment rationalism to neoclassical restraint. Rousseau wanted literature that was spontaneous, passionate, and direct, that stripped away social conventions and revealed the authentic human heart. His influence on Romanticism was enormous, but in the 1700s he represented the most radical wing of sensibility, the idea that feeling was not just equal to reason but superior to it.
The woman question. One of the most fascinating developments in 18th century criticism was the emergence of women critics and the debate over women's relationship to literature. The cult of sensibility feminized reading and criticism in complex ways. On one hand, it elevated qualities traditionally associated with women, sensitivity, emotional responsiveness, sympathy, as marks of sophisticated taste. Women were seen as naturally more capable of refined feeling and therefore better readers of novels. This gave women cultural authority they'd been denied in earlier periods when criticism focused on classical learning that women were excluded from. On the other hand, this feminization of reading was used to attack literature itself as a trivial, emotional, feminine pursuit inferior to serious, masculine intellectual work. Critics worried that too much novel reading would make men effeminate, turning them into weeping, sensitive creatures who lacked masculine rationality and strength. The debate over sensibility was entangled with anxiety about gender roles, about whether the new emotional literature was empowering women or corrupting men. Women writers began publishing their own criticism, defending novels against attacks, and theorizing about literature's effects. Mary Wollstonecraft, before she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, worked as a reviewer and wrote critical essays about fiction. She argued that novels could be educational for women if they depicted realistic characters and situations rather than romantic fantasies. Wollstonecraft recognized that sensibility could be weaponized against women, training them to be passive, emotional, and dependent on male protection. She wanted literature that would cultivate women's reason alongside their feelings. Why this changed everything. The 18th century cult of sensibility accomplished something revolutionary. It made emotional response a legitimate form of engagement with literature. Before this period, criticism was intellectual analysis, judging works against rational standards. After this period, it was impossible to separate critical judgment from emotional experience. The idea that great literature should move you, that feeling is a way of knowing, that tears and laughter and fear are valid responses that tell us something important about a text, all of this comes from sensibility criticism. This era also invented the modern relationship between readers and fictional characters. The idea that you should identify with characters, care about them, feel their emotions as if they were real people, this was new. Earlier readers understood characters as types or moral examples. Sensibility readers treated them as friends and enemies, people whose fates mattered personally. This is why modern readers get angry when favorite characters die, why we argue about character motivations as if they're real people with agency, why fanfiction exists. The 18th century trained us to have parasocial relationships with fictional beings. The cult of sensibility also established emotional labor as central to reading and criticism. Reading wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but an emotional workout that required investment and vulnerability. Critics weren't just analysts, but emotional experts who could articulate feelings that ordinary readers experienced but couldn't name. This created the modern role of the critic as someone who doesn't just judge whether a book is well constructed, but whether it makes you feel the right things in the right ways. Whether its emotional effects are authentic or manipulative, earned or cheap. Gothic literature, romantic poetry, Victorian melodrama, modern young adult novels, prestige television that makes you ugly cry, all of it descends from the moment in the 1700s when critics decided that making people feel was literature's highest achievement. We live in a world where emotional journey is a compliment, where I ugly cried is a book review, where it destroyed me means you loved it. The age of sensibility invented the emotional grammar we still use to talk about why stories matter. They made it respectable, even sophisticated, to care deeply about imaginary people and admit that books can break your heart. The revolution in how we think about genius. The Romantic movement exploded onto the literary scene in the late 1700s and early 1800s as a direct rebellion against everything the Enlightenment stood for. Where Enlightenment critics valued reason, order, and classical rules, the Romantics worshipped emotion, spontaneity, and individual genius. Where neoclassical criticism said great art came from studying and following ancient models, Romantic criticism said great art came from the unique inner vision of the individual artist. This wasn't just a difference in taste, it was a completely different theory of what art was and where it came from. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge published lyrical ballads in 1798 with a preface that became one of the most important works of literary criticism ever written.
Wordsworth declared that poetry should use the language of ordinary people rather than elevated poetic diction, that it should focus on common life and natural settings rather than classical mythology, and that its goal was to express authentic emotion rather than demonstrate learning. He defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, making emotion rather than craft the essence of poetic creation. This was revolutionary because it made the poet's inner life more important than their technical skill. Coleridge took this further in Biographia Literaria in 1817, which combined autobiography, philosophy, and literary theory into a sprawling meditation on imagination. Coleridge distinguished between fancy, which just rearranges existing ideas, and imagination, which creates genuinely new syntheses. True poets had imagination, the godlike power to fuse disparate elements into original wholes. This elevated the poet to near divine status, someone with access to truths ordinary people couldn't perceive. Coleridge was arguing that poets were prophets and seers, that their insights into human nature and reality were more profound than what scientists or philosophers could discover through reason. This had massive implications for criticism. If poetry came from spontaneous feeling and imaginative vision, then analyzing it through rational rules made no sense. You couldn't improve poetry by following guidelines or studying models. You could only open yourself to inspiration and express your authentic self. This made traditional criticism seem useless or even harmful, an attempt to constrain genius with arbitrary conventions. Romantic critics shifted from prescribing rules to describing effects, from judging whether works followed standards to analyzing how they made readers feel and what visions they communicated. The birth of the Byronic hero. Lord Byron became both a practitioner and theorist of a new kind of literary character that would dominate Western literature for the next 2 centuries. The Byronic hero was dark, brooding, tormented by inner conflicts, alienated from society, and morally ambiguous. Byron's Childe Harold and Don Juan featured protagonists who were fascinating precisely because they were flawed, whose suffering and defiance made them attractive rather than repulsive. Byron himself lived the part, scandalizing English society with his sexual escapades, rumored incest, and political radicalism before fleeing England permanently. Byron's criticism, found mostly in his letters and prefaces, defended literature's right to depict immoral behavior without endorsing it. He mocked critics who demanded clear moral lessons, arguing that great literature showed human nature in all its complexity, including its darkness. This was a direct attack on Samuel Johnson's insistence that virtue always be rewarded in fiction. Byron claimed that moralizing made literature dishonest, and that readers were sophisticated enough to distinguish between depicting vice and promoting it. This defense of moral ambiguity opened the door for all the anti-heroes and sympathetic villains that came after. The Byronic hero transformed how we think about character motivation and sympathy. Before Romanticism, villains were villains because they were morally defective. End of story. After Byron, villains had backstories, psychological complexity, and often legitimate grievances against society. They were rebels whose defiance might be wrong, but was also admirable. This created the template for every misunderstood villain, from Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights to Walter White in Breaking Bad. The idea that bad people can be sympathetic, that understanding someone's trauma explains their behavior, that society's judgment might be wrong and the outsider might be right, all of this comes from Romantic criticism's obsession with the dark hero. The German Revolution in thought. While British romantics were revolutionizing poetry, German romantics were developing philosophical theories that would reshape all of criticism. Friedrich Schlegel wrote fragments and essays arguing that romantic poetry should be progressive and universal, constantly evolving and incorporating all genres and modes. He invented the concept of romantic irony, the idea that artists should simultaneously create and critique their work, maintaining awareness that all representation is artificial. This was postmodernism before postmodernism existed, the notion that art should acknowledge its own constructed nature. The Schlegel brothers, Friedrich and August Wilhelm, also began the systematic study of literature as an academic discipline. They argued that criticism should be historical and comparative, understanding works in their cultural contexts rather than judging them by universal standards. This historicist approach was revolutionary because it meant that different periods and cultures might have different aesthetic values, that there was no single timeless standard for great literature. Greek tragedy and Shakespearean drama were different but equally valid because they emerged from different worldviews. This relativism challenged the idea that classical Greek and Roman literature were eternal models everyone should imitate. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment in 1790 provided philosophical foundations for Romantic aesthetics, even though Kant himself wasn't a Romantic. Kant argued that aesthetic judgment was subjective yet universal, that when we say something is beautiful, we're describing our feeling but claiming everyone should share it. Beauty wasn't a property of objects, but a response of the human mind encountering certain forms. This made aesthetics autonomous, separate from moral goodness or practical usefulness. Art could be valuable purely for aesthetic reasons, without needing to teach lessons or serve purposes. This gave critics license to evaluate literature on artistic grounds alone. The cult of originality. Romantic criticism invented our modern obsession with originality and authenticity. Before Romanticism, imitation of great models was considered the path to excellence. Renaissance writers proudly borrowed plots from ancient sources. Restoration dramatists revised earlier plays, and nobody considered this theft or lack of originality. Romantic critics reversed this completely, declaring that true art must be original, expressing the unique vision of the individual artist. Copying others was now failure rather than learning. This created the modern concept of plagiarism as artistic sin. When earlier writers borrowed freely from sources, it was considered skillful adaptation. When Coleridge was discovered to have lifted passages from German philosophers, it was called plagiarism and considered shameful. The Romantics made authenticity the supreme value, the idea that your work should express your genuine self rather than conforming to expectations or imitating models. This sounds liberating, but it also created tremendous anxiety for artists who now had to be original or fail, who couldn't acknowledge influences without seeming derivative. Edward Young's Conjectures on Original Composition in 1759 was a precursor to Romantic originality worship. Young argued that imitating great writers made you at best a second-rate version of them, while expressing your own genius might make you a first-rate original. He used the metaphor of botanical growth. Great writing grows from the author's mind like plants from soil, organic and unique, rather than being manufactured according to rules. This organic metaphor became central to Romantic criticism, the idea that poems grow naturally from the poet's imagination, rather than being constructed through conscious craft. Nature as the ultimate truth. Romantic critics elevated nature to religious significance. Nature wasn't just pretty scenery, but the source of spiritual truth, moral instruction, and aesthetic beauty.
Wordsworth wrote in The Prelude about how encounters with nature shaped his poetic development and moral consciousness. He argued that children raised in nature developed better moral instincts than those educated in cities, that there was something fundamentally corrupting about civilization and redemptive about wilderness. This was Rousseau's noble savage idea applied to aesthetics and criticism. This valorization of nature had several critical implications. First, it made rural and natural settings more legitimate subjects for serious literature than urban or social settings. Second, it suggested that the best poets were those most sensitive to nature's influences, most capable of perceiving and expressing natural truths. Third, it created a hierarchy where spontaneous expressions inspired by nature were superior to labored compositions created in studies following rules. The ideal poet was someone wandering lonely as a cloud, struck by inspiration from daffodils, rather than someone sitting in a library with classical texts. Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defense of Poetry in 1821 made the most extravagant claims for poetry's importance. Shelley argued that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, that their imaginative visions shaped culture and morality more powerfully than laws or philosophy. Poetry wasn't entertainment or moral instruction, but prophetic truth-telling. Poets perceived fundamental realities that others missed, and their work gradually civilized humanity. This made criticism almost sacred. The interpretation and defense of poetry was defending humanity's highest achievement against utilitarian Philistines who couldn't understand its value. The dark side of Romantic criticism. Romantic criticism's celebration of individual genius and spontaneous feeling had toxic consequences that still affect us. The idea that true artists are tormented souls who suffer for their art created the stereotype of the tortured genius. This romanticized mental illness, addiction, and self-destructive behavior as signs of authenticity. Countless artists have destroyed themselves trying to live up to this romantic ideal, believing that suffering made them more genuine, or that madness was the price of creativity. The romantic association between artistry and psychological torment has probably killed more people than it's inspired. The romantic elevation of feeling over reason also enabled anti-intellectual attitudes that persist today. The idea that authentic emotion is more valuable than rational analysis, that thinking too much kills creativity, that simple people with pure hearts understand truth better than educated elites, all of this comes from romantic criticism. This can lead to celebrating ignorance as innocence and dismissing expertise as corruption. When modern politicians claim they represent real America against coastal elites, they're using romantic rhetoric about authentic feeling versus artificial sophistication. Romantic criticism also created our modern anxiety about selling out. The idea that true artists create for artistic expression rather than money, that commercial success is suspicious and suggests compromise, that the best art is appreciated only by sensitive minorities while the masses prefer garbage, all of this stems from romantic attacks on commercialism. The Romantics faced the rise of market capitalism and mass literacy, and they responded by declaring that real art was incompatible with popularity. This created the high-low culture split that still divides literary fiction from genre fiction, indie films from blockbusters, authentic artists from commercial sellouts. Why we still live in their world. Every time you hear someone say, "trust your gut," or "follow your heart," that's romantic thinking. Every time someone defends offensive art by saying the artist was being authentic, that's romantic criticism. The entire creative writing workshop mantra of "write what you know" and "find your unique voice" comes straight from romantic theories about authentic self-expression. The idea that real artists are rebels who defy conventions, that suffering and struggle produce better art than comfort and stability, that creative people are special and different from normal folks,
All of this is romantic mythology that we've absorbed so completely we don't even realize it's a historical construction.
The Romantics invented the modern author as celebrity and personality. Before Romanticism, people read poems and plays without caring much about the author's biography or personality. The Romantics made the author's life inseparable from their work, turned poets into rock stars whose personal lives became public spectacles. Byron was perhaps the first modern celebrity, famous not just for his writing, but for his lifestyle, his scandals, his image. This created the template for every artist whose personal brand matters as much as their output, from Hemingway's machismo to Kanye's controversies. The sympathetic villain, the misunderstood anti-hero, the rebel with a cause, these character types dominate modern storytelling because Romantic critics taught us to see defiance as heroic and outsiders as potentially right. When we root for Loki over Thor, Killmonger over Black Panther, or any charismatic villain with understandable motivations, we're experiencing Romantic criticism in action. The Romantics taught us that society's outcasts might be its prophets, that the criminal might be nobler than the judge, that darkness and complexity are more interesting than simple goodness. Most fundamentally, Romanticism gave us the idea that art should challenge and transform us, rather than simply please or instruct us. The notion that literature exists to expand consciousness, shatter comfortable assumptions, and make us see reality differently, that comes from Romantic theories about poetry's visionary power. When we say a book changed my life or a film opened my eyes, we're describing the kind of transformation Romantic critics believed great art should produce. They made art into a secular religion, and we're still believers.
The domestic angel and her demons. The Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, was obsessed with the separate spheres ideology that men belonged to the public world of business and politics, while women belonged to the private world of home and family. Victorian critics developed theories about literature that reinforced this division, arguing that different kinds of books were appropriate for men versus women. Men should read challenging, intellectual works, philosophy, political economy, serious literature that prepared them for public life. Women should read novels that taught them to be good wives and mothers, that cultivated their moral sensibility without overtaxing their supposedly delicate minds. This gendered approach to criticism created bizarre contradictions. Critics simultaneously elevated women as moral guardians whose purity protected society from corruption, and dismissed them as intellectually inferior creatures who needed literature carefully filtered to avoid dangerous ideas. Women were supposedly more naturally moral than men, but also more susceptible to corruption through reading. This meant Victorian critics spent enormous energy policing what women read, warning about novels that might give them wrong ideas about love, marriage, or their proper social role. John Ruskin wrote essays on women's education, arguing that women should read widely but always with male guidance, that their reading should cultivate refinement and moral feeling without making them ambitious or dissatisfied with domestic life. In Sesame and Lilies in 1865, Ruskin described women as naturally intuitive and sympathetic, suited for moral influence but not rational analysis. He recommended literature that would strengthen these natural feminine qualities while avoiding anything that might make women question their subordinate position. This wasn't just literary criticism, it was social engineering through reading lists. George Henry Lewis, critic and partner of George Eliot, wrote extensively about women's relationship to literature, often contradicting himself spectacularly. He argued that women could be great novelists because novel writing required emotional insight and observation of domestic life, skills women naturally possessed. But he also worried that too much reading made women unrealistic about marriage, gave them romantic expectations that actual husbands couldn't fulfill, and distracted them from their proper duties. Victorian critics wanted women to read, but not too much, to be educated, but not intellectual, to be morally refined, but not independently thinking. The Bronte problem, when women wrote back. The Bronte sisters created a crisis for Victorian criticism by writing novels that violated every rule about proper feminine literature. Jane Eyre featured a plain, poor heroine who refused to be submissive, who demanded equality in marriage, and who walked away from the man she loved rather than compromise her principles. Wuthering Heights depicted passionate, destructive love with no clear moral lesson, featuring Heathcliff as a Byronic hero taken to terrifying extremes. These novels were wildly popular with women readers, which terrified male critics who saw them as dangerous propaganda for female independence. Early reviews of Jane Eyre reveal the anxiety beautifully. Critics praised the novel's power and originality while simultaneously condemning its coarseness and masculine style. Several reviewers assumed the author must be male because no proper woman could have written such fierce, rebellious prose. When Charlotte Bronte's identity was revealed, critics became even more disturbed, arguing that women who wrote such passionate, unrestrained novels must be personally immoral or at least unfeminine. The Ladies' magazine warned that Jane Eyre would teach women to be discontented with their lot and ungrateful for male protection. But here's where Victorian criticism gets really interesting. Despite official condemnation, these novels became classics because women readers loved them and wouldn't let them die. Critics tried to domesticate the Brontes, arguing that their novels actually reinforced traditional morality if read correctly. They claimed Jane Eyre taught that true love required equality and mutual respect, which was sort of true, but missed how revolutionary the novel's feminism was for 1847.
They argued that Wuthering Heights showed the destructive consequences of ungoverned passion, ignoring that Heathcliff remained the most magnetic character despite being a monster. Charlotte Bronte's preface to later editions of Wuthering Heights tried to make her sister's work respectable by framing it as a moral warning. She compared Emily to an artist painting vulgar subjects to reveal their ugliness, not to glorify them. This defensive critical strategy, claiming that depicting vice actually condemned it, became standard for defending controversial literature throughout the Victorian era. Critics learned they could allow almost anything in novels as long as they interpreted it as ultimately supporting conventional morality. This interpretive gymnastics meant that subversive literature could circulate while official criticism maintained that everything reinforced proper values. The invention of relationship fantasy. Victorian novels created templates for romance that we're still using and still being damaged by. The plot of passionate but difficult courtship, misunderstandings and obstacles, the hero's eventual transformation through the heroine's love, this became the standard narrative pattern. Rochester in Jane Eyre is literally a man who keeps his wife locked in the attic, lies to Jane, tries to commit bigamy, and remains the romantic hero. Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is abusive, vengeful, and possibly demonic, yet generations of readers have found him irresistibly attractive. Victorian critics generally approved these patterns because they showed women reforming bad men through love and moral influence. This fit the angel in the house ideology perfectly. Women's special role was civilizing male brutality through their superior morality. Critics read these novels as showing that even difficult, damaged men could be redeemed by the right woman's love. They completely ignored the toxic message this sent, that women should choose morally questionable men because changing them proves your special worth, that emotional unavailability and darkness are attractive rather than warning signs, that love conquers all, including abuse and betrayal. The figure of the dark hero became standard in Victorian literature, and criticism celebrated it. Critics wrote admiringly about characters who were proud, cold, seemingly unfeeling, who treated heroines badly before eventually revealing their secret devotion. Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice became the prototype, initially insulting and dismissive, gradually revealing his worth, ultimately transformed by love. Victorian critics interpreted this pattern as showing male pride humbled by female virtue. They missed that it was also training women to interpret male coldness as secret passion, to see rejection as hidden attraction, to believe that cruel behavior masks genuine feeling. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh in 1856, a novel in verse about a woman poet, included extended critical passages about literature and gender. Aurora argues that women should write about modern life and their own experiences rather than imitating masculine epic traditions. She claims women bring necessary perspectives to literature that men cannot provide. But even this feminist work ends with Aurora accepting help from her male cousin Romney after he's been blinded and humbled, reinforcing the pattern of female independence ultimately domesticated through romance. Victorian critics praised Aurora Leigh while carefully containing its radical potential. Sensation fiction and the moral panic. The 1860s brought sensation novels, melodramatic thrillers featuring murder, bigamy, madness, and strong female characters who violated every rule of proper femininity. Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White and Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret became massive bestsellers despite vicious critical attacks. Critics coined the term sensation fiction as an insult, arguing these novels appealed to base instincts rather than moral sensibility, that they were literary opium, addicting readers to excitement without nutritional value. The critical panic over sensation fiction revealed deep anxiety about women's reading and thinking. Lady Audley's Secret featured a beautiful blonde heroine who was actually a murderous bigamist, willing to do anything to maintain her social position. She was gorgeous, charming, and completely amoral, the opposite of the passive domestic angel.
Critics were horrified that women readers found her fascinating rather than simply evil, that the novel made her almost sympathetic by showing how limited women's options were. The Archbishop of York literally preached sermons against sensation novels, claiming they corrupted female readers and destroyed their moral sense. Critics like Margaret Oliphant wrote essays condemning sensation fiction as unwholesome and degrading, particularly dangerous for young women whose minds were supposedly impressionable and vulnerable. Oliphant argued that these novels taught women to value excitement over duty, to admire cleverness over virtue, to see marriage as a trap rather than a sacred calling. She claimed sensation novels made women dissatisfied with ordinary domestic life by filling their heads with improbable adventures and passionate emotions. The critical establishment tried desperately to kill sensation fiction through negative reviews, but readers ignored them and kept buying the books. What critics missed was that sensation fiction's popularity revealed women's hunger for representations of female agency and power, even in transgressive forms. Lady Audley might be a villain, but she was an active villain who made things happen rather than passively suffering. Women readers could enjoy her scheming and manipulations while still condemning her morality. Sensation fiction gave women protagonists who were complex, intelligent, and active, even when they were criminals. This was far more interesting than endless variations on the patient, suffering, moral domestic angel. Matthew Arnold and high culture as class weapon. Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy in 1869 established criticism as the guardian of civilization against democratic vulgarity. Arnold argued that the best literature embodied eternal values and timeless truths,
that exposure to great works cultivated one's best self and prevented society from descending into anarchy. He defined culture as the best that has been thought and said, positioning critics as the priests of this secular religion, who could identify true greatness and distinguish it from popular trash. Arnold's criticism was explicitly elitist and conservative. He worried that mass education and political reform were empowering people who lacked the cultural refinement to use power wisely. He believed that preserving high culture against popular taste was essential for maintaining social order. This meant critics had to resist commercial success as a criterion for literary value, to insist that what the masses enjoyed was probably inferior to what educated elites appreciated. Arnold gave academic critics their modern role as defenders of standards against market forces. His influence on Victorian criticism was enormous and largely negative. Arnold reinforced the idea that literature divides into high art for refined sensibilities versus low entertainment for the vulgar masses. He made it impossible to appreciate popular literature on its own terms because its popularity itself suggested it wasn't truly great. This created the snobbery that still plagues literary criticism, the assumption that what ordinary people enjoy is automatically inferior to what professors assign. Arnold wanted criticism to improve society, but his approach made critics into gatekeepers who dismissed most of what actual readers loved. Arnold also gendered this divide in subtle ways. The serious literature he championed was largely written by and about men dealing with public and philosophical issues. The popular literature he dismissed as inferior was largely novels written by and for women dealing with domestic and emotional issues. By establishing that the best literature was masculine in subject and style, Arnold reinforced women's exclusion from literary greatness. Victorian critics could praise individual women writers as exceptional while maintaining that women's typical concerns and styles were inherently less important than men's. The double standard made criticism. Victorian critics applied wildly different standards to male and female writers, and their reviews reveal this constantly. When male writers depicted sexuality, violence, or moral ambiguity, critics analyzed it as artistic choice and philosophical depth. When female writers did the same, critics questioned their femininity and morality.
George Eliot had to publish under a male pseudonym initially because critics dismissed novels by women as trivial romances. Once revealed as female, she faced constant critical pressure to prove she was exceptional, not like other women writers. The critical reception of Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market in 1862 perfectly illustrates this. The poem is erotically charged, featuring sister goblin fruit that is obviously sexual, depicting female desire and temptation. Male critics bent over backwards to interpret it as purely allegorical religious instruction, ignoring or denying the obvious sexuality. They couldn't admit that a respectable Victorian woman wrote erotic poetry, so they reinterpreted it until it fit their assumptions about feminine propriety. This critical blindness meant women writers could include subversive content as long as they left room for domesticated readings. Victorian critics also punished women writers for biographical impropriety in ways they never did with men. George Eliot lived openly with George Henry Lewes without marriage because he couldn't divorce his wife. And critics constantly brought this up when discussing her work, implying her moral irregularity tainted her fiction. Meanwhile, male writers who kept mistresses, frequented prostitutes, or abandoned wives faced no similar critical consequences. The Victorian double standard that women must be morally pure while men could be rakish extended fully into literary criticism. Why Victorian patterns still wreck relationships?
The romantic patterns Victorian critics celebrated and analyzed are the same patterns that produce toxic relationships today. The belief that loving someone enough can change them, that emotional unavailability masks deep passion, that cruel treatment might be misunderstood devotion, that women should pursue challenging men who need fixing. All of this comes straight from Victorian literary criticism's interpretation of romance plots. Every woman who's ever thought, "he's mean to me because he really cares," is running Victorian programming. The not like other girls trope that plagues modern feminism comes directly from Victorian criticism's treatment of exceptional women. Critics praised individual women writers by distinguishing them from typical feminine weakness and sentimentality. This taught women that being special meant rejecting association with other women, that female solidarity was impossible because most women were inferior. This divide-and-conquer strategy kept women from recognizing their common interests and organizing collectively. It made internalized misogyny seem like sophisticated literary judgment. Victorian criticism also established the pattern of using literature to prescribe women's behavior while claiming to just describe reality. Critics would analyze novels to extract rules for proper feminine conduct, then use those rules to judge real women's behavior, creating a circular system where literature shaped life, which was then represented in more literature reinforcing the same patterns. This is exactly how modern rom-coms and YA novels work, presenting relationship patterns as natural and inevitable while actually constructing and reinforcing them. The Victorian era perfected the art of containing subversive literature through interpretation. Critics learned they could allow almost any content as long as they framed it as ultimately supporting conventional morality. This strategy is still used today when people defend problematic media by claiming it's actually subversive or satirical if you read it right. The ability to interpret away obvious meanings through sophisticated analysis serves conservative ends by preventing transgressive literature from having transgressive effects. Victorian critics were masters of this interpretive domestication, and we've inherited their techniques.
The unconscious invades literature. Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, arguing that dreams were disguised expressions of unconscious desires, primarily sexual and aggressive wishes that consciousness couldn't acknowledge. Freud developed techniques for interpreting dream symbols to reveal hidden meanings, and critics immediately saw that the same techniques could apply to literature. If dreams were symbolic expressions of unconscious conflicts, then so were poems, novels, and plays. Authors might think they were writing about one thing, but they were actually revealing their deepest psychological secrets without knowing it. This was revolutionary because it completely changed what criticism could do. Previously, critics analyzed what authors consciously intended and what texts explicitly said. Freudian critics analyzed what authors unconsciously expressed and what texts secretly meant beneath their surface content. Every story became a puzzle with hidden meanings that only psychoanalytic interpretation could reveal. This gave critics enormous power because they could claim to understand texts better than their own authors did, to see meanings that the conscious mind had disguised through symbolism and displacement. Freud himself applied his theories to literature in essays analyzing specific works and characters. His essay on Shakespeare's Hamlet argued that Hamlet's famous indecision about killing Claudius stemmed from unconscious identification with him. Claudius had acted out Hamlet's own Oedipal desire to kill his father and marry his mother, so Hamlet couldn't punish Claudius without punishing himself. This reading ignored the play's explicit concerns with political legitimacy, religious doubt, and theatrical representation, reducing everything to psychosexual family drama. But it was brilliantly persuasive because it seemed to explain Hamlet's puzzling behavior through psychological realism.
Freud's essay on Leonardo da Vinci took a childhood memory Leonardo recorded and used it to psychoanalyze him, arguing that his art revealed his repressed homosexuality and unresolved relationship with his mother. Freud built an elaborate psychological profile from a single ambiguous anecdote, interpreting Leonardo's paintings as symptoms of his neurosis. This established the psychobiographical approach to criticism, using works to diagnose their creators' psychological conditions. The fact that Freud's interpretation was based on a mistranslation and his conclusions were mostly wrong didn't stop generations of critics from using the same methods. Everything is sex, everything is Oedipus. The core of Freudian criticism was the Oedipus complex, Freud's theory that children unconsciously desire the opposite-sex parent and feel hostility toward the same-sex parent, then repress these desires as they mature. Freudian critics found Oedipal themes everywhere in literature. Father-son conflicts, Oedipal. Mother fixation, Oedipal. Rivalry with authority, Oedipal. Quest narratives, Oedipal journey toward maturity. Romance plots, Oedipal desire transferred to appropriate objects. Literally, any human relationship could be interpreted as containing Oedipal dynamics. This reductive approach made psychoanalytic criticism simultaneously powerful and ridiculous. It was powerful because it provided a universal interpretive key that could unlock any text, giving critics a method that seemed scientific and systematic. It was ridiculous because it reduced all human motivation to variations on the same sexual family drama, ignoring historical context, cultural specificity, and authors' conscious intentions. The joke about Freudian criticism is that every sword fight is actually about dicks and every cave exploration is about returning to the womb. And that joke exists because Freudian critics actually made those arguments seriously. Ernest Jones, a psychoanalyst and Freud's biographer, wrote Hamlet and Oedipus in 1949, expanding Freud's brief essay into a book-length psychoanalytic reading. Jones argued that Hamlet was Shakespeare's unconscious working through his own Oedipal conflicts, triggered by his father's death and his son Hamnet's death. He claimed that the play's universal appeal came from its expression of universal Oedipal dynamics that every viewer unconsciously recognized.
This completely ignored the play's status as a revenge tragedy following genre conventions, its political dimensions, its meta-theatrical complexity, its philosophical concerns. Everything became psychology, and psychology became sex and family. Marie Bonaparte, a French psychoanalyst and analysand of Freud, wrote a psychobiography of Edgar Allan Poe that interpreted his stories as expressions of necrophilic desires stemming from his mother's death when he was an infant. She read every female character in Poe as representing his dead mother, every death scene as expressing his desire to possess her corpse, every premature burial as symbolizing the trauma of maternal loss. Her interpretations were wildly speculative, but they established the pattern for psychoanalytic criticism. Find traumatic events in the author's life, find themes in their work, assert causal connections between biography and creativity. The text as patient. Freudian critics developed the practice of treating texts as patients who revealed symptoms that could be diagnosed. They looked for repetitions, obsessions, contradictions, and gaps in texts as evidence of unconscious conflicts. If an author kept returning to certain themes or images, that suggested psychological fixation. If a text contained logical contradictions or plot inconsistencies, those were symptoms of repression, places where the unconscious message conflicted with the conscious narrative. Critics became psychoanalysts of literature, decoding symptoms to reveal the hidden disease. This approach produced fascinating but often absurd readings. Critics argued that adventure stories were really about masturbation anxiety, that ghost stories expressed guilt over death wishes toward parents, that love poetry revealed unresolved Oedipal desires,
They found phallic symbols in towers, trees, weapons, and literally any vertical object. They found vaginal symbols in caves, valleys, wounds, and literally any receptacle. They interpreted eating as oral fixation, hoarding as anal retention, and competitiveness as phallic aggression. No action was innocent, every detail revealed psychological significance. The problem was that Freudian interpretation was unfalsifiable. If evidence supported the interpretation, it confirmed the theory. If evidence contradicted the interpretation, that proved repression was working to hide the truth, which also confirmed the theory. Authors could deny the psychoanalytic meanings critics found in their work, but that denial was itself evidence of repression. Readers could find the interpretations implausible, but that showed their own resistance to acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The theory was designed to be irrefutable, which meant it wasn't really interpretation, but imposition. Despite these problems, Freudian criticism made genuine contributions to how we read. It taught critics to pay attention to what texts don't say, to gaps and silences as meaningful as explicit content. It made symbolism and imagery central to interpretation rather than peripheral decoration. It introduced the idea that meaning could be latent and unconscious rather than manifest and intentional. These insights remained valuable even after specific Freudian interpretations fell out of favor. The psychoanalytic emphasis on hidden meanings, on texts saying more than they know, permanently changed critical practice. The Carl Jung and the Mythmakers. Carl Jung broke with Freud over the nature of the unconscious, arguing that beyond the personal unconscious Freud described lay a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious contained archetypes, universal symbols and patterns that recurred across cultures and throughout history. Jungian critics searched literature for archetypal patterns, arguing that great works tapped into these universal structures, and that's why they resonate across time and culture. Maud Bodkin's archetypal patterns in poetry in 1934 applied Jung's theories to literary analysis, identifying recurring archetypal figures like the Great Mother, the Shadow, the Trickster, and the Wise Old Man in literature, from ancient epics to modern novels. She argued that these patterns appealed to something deep in the human psyche, that readers responded to them emotionally before intellectually, because they touched our collective unconscious.
This made literature a kind of cultural dreaming, expressing universal human experiences and conflicts through particular stories. Northrop Frye developed the most influential archetypal criticism in Anatomy of Criticism in 1957, creating an elaborate taxonomy of literary genres and modes based on recurring mythic patterns. Frye argued that all literature was displaced mythology, that comedy, romance, tragedy, and irony corresponded to the four seasons and expressed fundamental human relationships with nature and society. His system was brilliantly comprehensive and completely ahistorical, treating all literature as variations on timeless patterns regardless of cultural or historical specificity. Jungian criticism was less reductive than Freudian because it didn't reduce everything to sexual symbolism, but it had its own problems. It made literature seem universal when it was actually historically specific, finding sameness where there was difference. It tended toward mysticism, treating archetypes as if they were real entities rather than interpretive constructs. And it often ignored how power and politics shaped literary production, focusing on universal human nature while ignoring particular social conditions. Still, the archetypal approach gave critics a way to talk about why certain stories and symbols seemed to work across different contexts, why some narratives felt profound and others didn't. The dark side of psychoanalytic criticism. Freudian criticism's most toxic legacy was pathologizing authors and readers. Critics used psychoanalytic theory to declare that certain kinds of writing revealed mental illness or perversion. Lesbian writers were diagnosed as having penis envy.
Gay male writers were analyzed as suffering from arrested development. Women who wrote powerful female characters were interpreted as having castration anxiety. Authors who didn't fit heterosexual norms were treated as psychological case studies whose work was interesting primarily as symptoms of their dysfunction. This diagnostic approach was used as a weapon against marginal voices. When Virginia Woolf wrote experimental novels challenging conventional narrative, psychoanalytic critics interpreted her modernism as symptomatic of her mental illness rather than as aesthetic innovation. When James Baldwin wrote about homosexual desire, critics psychoanalyzed him rather than engaging with his arguments about racism and sexuality. Psychoanalytic criticism gave bigots a pseudo-scientific vocabulary for dismissing threatening literature as merely pathological rather than politically or aesthetically challenging. The same diagnostic approach applied to readers. Freudian critics argued that enjoying certain kinds of literature revealed your own neuroses and repressions. If you loved horror stories, you had unresolved death anxiety. If you read romance novels, you had unrealistic relationship expectations from Oedipal fixation. If you preferred fantasy to realism, you were escapist and refusing to confront reality. This made literary taste into psychological diagnosis, another way to pathologize ordinary pleasures and enforce cultural hierarchies. Liking the wrong kind of literature became evidence of mental deficiency. Psychoanalytic criticism also reinforced gender essentialism by treating masculinity and femininity as fundamental psychological categories. Freudians argued that healthy psychological development meant accepting your biological sex and its associated gender role. Women who rejected traditional femininity were diagnosed as having masculinity complexes. Men who displayed supposedly feminine traits were seen as inadequately developed. This made nonconformity into pathology, using psychological theory to enforce conventional gender norms. The damage this did to LGBTQ people and gender nonconforming individuals cannot be overstated. Why we can't escape Freud. Even though academic criticism mostly abandoned strict Freudian interpretation decades ago, its influence pervades how we talk about literature and culture. Every time someone says a story is really about something other than its explicit content, that's Freudian thinking. Every time we analyze a character's backstory to explain their behavior, we're doing psychoanalytic reading. Every time we notice sexual symbolism or interpret an image as representing something hidden, we're using tools Freudian criticism developed.
Pop culture is soaked in Freudian concepts even when people don't realize it. Every superhero origin story that traces the hero's powers or mission to childhood trauma is Freudian. Every villain whose evil stems from parental abuse or neglect is Freudian. Every romance where characters must overcome psychological barriers to intimacy is Freudian. The entire therapeutic culture where self-knowledge through exploring your past is the key to happiness, that's Freudian. We live in a Freudian universe, even though most people don't read Freud. Film criticism especially embraced psychoanalytic theory and never entirely left it. Feminist film theorists in the 1970s used psychoanalysis to explain how cinema positioned viewers and created desire. They analyzed how camera angles, editing patterns, and narrative structures reflected and reinforced patriarchal psychology. This work was brilliant and influential, but it accepted Freud's basic framework while trying to subvert it. Even critics trying to escape Freudian categories ended up working within them, using psychoanalytic concepts to critique psychoanalysis itself. The most lasting contribution of psychoanalytic criticism was making interpretation hermeneutically suspicious, teaching us that texts and people don't always mean what they say, that surface meanings hide deeper truths, that close reading can reveal what was unconsciously expressed. This suspicious interpretation became standard critical practice across all theoretical schools. Whether critics are Marxists looking for ideology, feminists finding patriarchy, or post-colonialists discovering imperialism, they all use the basic psychoanalytic move of reading beneath the surface to find hidden meanings the text doesn't acknowledge. Freud taught us not to trust what texts say about themselves, and we never stopped being suspicious.
The new critics declare war on history. The new criticism emerged in the 1930s and 1940s, but dominated American and British academic criticism through the 1950s and 1960s. Its central idea was radical. Literary works should be analyzed as autonomous objects independent of their authors' biographies, historical contexts, or readers' emotional responses. The text itself, just the words on the page in their relationships to each other, was all that mattered. Everything else was irrelevant distraction from the real work of criticism, which was close reading of the text's formal properties. I.A. Richards pioneered this approach in practical criticism in 1929 by giving Cambridge students poems without author names or historical contexts and asking them to analyze the texts purely on internal evidence. Richards was horrified to discover that students brought all sorts of irrelevant associations and emotional responses to their readings, that they couldn't separate textual meaning from personal feelings or cultural assumptions. He concluded that criticism needed rigorous methods for analyzing texts objectively, focusing on how language actually worked rather than what readers wanted texts to mean. The American New Critics, led by figures like John Crow Ransom, Cleanth Brooks, and Robert Penn Warren, developed this into a full critical methodology. Their textbook, Understanding Poetry in 1938, revolutionized how literature was taught by providing detailed analyses of poems focusing on irony, paradox, ambiguity, and tension. They argued that great literature worked through complex interrelationships among its parts, that every word choice contributed to the overall meaning, and that readers needed to analyze these relationships carefully rather than just responding emotionally or searching for messages. W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley published 2 essays in the 1940s that became foundational texts for new criticism. The Intentional Fallacy in 1946 argued that what authors intended their work to mean was irrelevant to its actual meaning. If you had to read the author's diary or letters to understand a poem, then the poem had failed as a self-sufficient artwork. Meaning had to be available in the text itself through careful reading, not imported from external sources. This freed criticism from biographical research and made the critic's close reading more authoritative than the author's explanation. The Affective Fallacy in 1949 argued that readers' emotional responses were equally irrelevant to determining meaning. If you felt sad reading a poem, that might tell us about you, but it didn't tell us whether the poem was objectively sad or good. Criticism had to focus on textual properties that produce effects, not on the effects themselves. This was an attempt to make criticism scientific and objective, removing the subjectivity of both authorial intention and reader response in favor of analyzing the text as an object with determinable properties. The text becomes God. New critics treated literary works almost religiously as sacred objects containing inexhaustible meaning that rewarded intense interpretive attention. They developed close reading as a practice requiring careful, repeated examination of every word, every image, every sound pattern. Their interpretations were often brilliantly detailed, revealing complexities and ambiguities that casual readers missed. They showed that literary language worked differently from ordinary communication, that poems especially used irony, paradox, and multiple meanings to achieve effects impossible in straightforward prose. Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn in 1947 presented a series of close readings demonstrating how great poems work through paradox and ironic tension rather than direct statement. Brooks argued that the new critics' methods were particularly suited for analyzing modern poetry, which valued complexity and ambiguity over sentimental directness. His reading of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn focused on the poem's dramatic structure and the tensions between art and life, eternity and mortality, rather than on Keats's biography or romantic aesthetics. This made the poem timeless, a perfect verbal artifact rather than a historical document. The new critical approach had enormous pedagogical advantages. It could be taught systematically to students who didn't have extensive historical knowledge or refined sensibility. You could learn techniques for analyzing imagery, metaphor, symbol, irony, and paradox, then apply those techniques to any text. This democratized criticism in some ways, making it accessible to anyone willing to read closely rather than requiring classical education or cultural refinement. It also made literature teachable in universities as a distinct discipline with its own methods, not just a branch of history or moral philosophy. But the new critics' obsession with textual autonomy had bizarre consequences. It meant that knowing Shakespeare wrote Hamlet added nothing to understanding Hamlet. It meant that recognizing biblical allusions in Milton was only relevant if the meanings were fully contained within Milton's text. It meant that understanding the historical context of slavery was unnecessary for interpreting slave narratives. This willful historical blindness made new criticism powerful for technical analysis, but limited for understanding literature's relationship to the world that produced it and that it influenced. The new critics were also shockingly conservative in their politics and cultural values. Many were Southern agrarians who romanticized pre-industrial society and defended traditional hierarchies, including racial segregation. Their insistence that literature transcended history and politics was itself a political position, one that removed literature from debates about social change and justice. By treating poems as timeless aesthetic objects, they could ignore how literature participated in ideological struggles and how power shaped what counted as great literature. Their apparent objectivity masked deeply conservative commitments to tradition and hierarchy. Structuralism, the author dies in France too. While new critics were killing the author in America and Britain, French structuralists were independently arriving at similar conclusions through different routes. Structuralism emerged from linguistics, specifically Ferdinand de Saussure's theory that language was a system of differences where meaning came from relationships among signs rather than from connections between words and things. Structuralist critics applied this to literature, analyzing texts as systems of signs that produce meaning through their internal structures rather than through authorial expression or historical reference. Claude Lévi-Strauss pioneered structuralist analysis of myths, arguing that myths from different cultures shared underlying structures that revealed universal patterns in human thought. He analyzed myths as variations on basic binary oppositions like nature versus culture, raw versus cooked, life versus death. Lévi-Strauss claimed these structures were unconscious, that neither the original tellers nor later audiences were aware of them. Myths worked on people through these hidden patterns, not through their surface stories. This made interpretation scientific, uncovering structures through systematic analysis rather than intuitive understanding. Roland Barthes took structuralism into literary criticism with brilliant, provocative essays that made him an intellectual celebrity. His essay, The Death of the Author in 1967, declared that the traditional concept of the author as the origin and authority for textual meaning was obsolete. Barthes argued that texts were made from already existing cultural codes and conventions, that writing was always already intertextual, composed from fragments of previous texts. The author didn't create meaning from nothing, but assembled it from available cultural materials, like a DJ mixing samples rather than a composer writing original music. Barthes claimed that focusing on authors limited interpretation by treating texts as expressions of individual psychology or biography. Once we recognized that texts exceeded their author's control, we could read them in multiple ways, finding meanings the author never intended or imagined. This liberated readers to become active producers of meaning rather than passive consumers of authorial messages. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author, Barthes wrote, transferring interpretive authority from writers to readers and critics. This was the ultimate critical power grab, declaring that once texts entered the world, they belonged to whoever read them.
Barthes' S.Z. in 1970 demonstrated this approach by analyzing a Balzac short story, Sarracine, in exhaustive detail, breaking the text into fragments and analyzing how each fragment worked through 5 codes: hermeneutic, proaireic, semantic, symbolic, and cultural. Barthes showed that even a realistic 19th century story didn't transparently represent reality, but worked through complex conventions and codes that produce effects of realism. His reading found homoerotic subtexts, castration anxieties, and cultural stereotypes that Balzac certainly didn't consciously intend, proving that texts contained meanings beyond authorial control. The rise of reader response theory. If authors didn't control meaning and texts didn't contain fixed meanings, then readers must create meaning through the act of reading. Reader response critics in the 1960s and 1970s made this the center of their theories, arguing that literary works only existed as experiences in readers' minds. The text was just marks on paper until a reader activated it through interpretation, bringing their knowledge, expectations, and cultural frameworks to make sense of it. This made reading a creative act, not passive reception of pre-existing meaning. Wolfgang Iser developed a phenomenological account of reading in The Implied Reader in 1972, arguing that texts contained gaps and indeterminations that readers filled in based on their interpretive frameworks. Every text had an implied reader with certain competencies and expectations, and actual readers created meaning by trying to fulfill that role while also bringing their own perspectives. Reading was a dynamic process where expectations were formed and revised as the text unfolded, where meanings emerged from interaction between textual structures and reader activities. Stanley Fish took this to radical conclusions in Is There a Text in This Class in 1980, arguing that there were no objective textual properties independent of interpretive strategies. When critics thought they were discovering meanings in texts, they were actually creating those meanings through the interpretive methods they applied. Meanings weren't found, but made. Different interpretive communities would read the same text differently because they used different assumptions and strategies. Fish claimed there was no way to adjudicate between interpretations objectively because any criteria for judgment would itself be interpretive. This created the postmodern crisis of meaning, where no reading could claim to be definitively correct because correctness itself was just another interpretive construct. Fish's position seemed to lead to total relativism, where any interpretation was as good as any other, as long as some community accepted it. Critics worried this made criticism pointless. If meanings were just made up rather than discovered, why bother reading carefully? Fish replied that in practice, interpretive communities constrained what counted as plausible readings, that you couldn't just say anything and be taken seriously. But his theory made it hard to explain why some interpretations seemed better than others. Norman Holland took a psychoanalytic approach to reader response in 5 Readers Reading in 1975, analyzing how individual readers' personalities shaped their interpretations.
He studied 5 readers responding to the same stories and found that each reader essentially recreated their own identity themes through interpretation. They found in texts what they needed to find based on their psychological structures. This meant every reading was ultimately autobiographical, revealing more about the reader than the text. Holland's research suggested that objective interpretation was impossible because readers inevitably projected their own concerns onto whatever they read. The political weaponization of death of the author. The death of the author became a rallying cry for critics who wanted to read texts against their author's conscious intentions. Feminist critics used it to find feminist potential in texts by sexist authors. Marxist critics used it to reveal how texts unconsciously reproduce ideology even when authors thought they were being progressive. Queer critics used it to find homoerotic subtexts in works by homophobic authors. The death of the author meant you could critique J.K. Rowling's transphobia while still claiming Harry Potter supported trans rights, that you could find anti-racist readings in Conrad's Heart of Darkness despite Conrad's imperialism. This interpretive freedom was genuinely liberating for marginalized readers who had been told they were reading wrong when they found meanings that challenged dominant ideologies. Women who read Jane Eyre as feminist despite Charlotte Bronte's racism could cite reader response theory to validate their interpretations. Gay readers who found queer subtext in classic literature despite authors' homophobia could argue that textual meanings exceeded authorial control. The death of the author gave permission to read creatively and politically, to use literature for purposes its creators never intended or would have opposed. But this same freedom created problems. If authorial intention didn't matter, then Holocaust deniers could interpret testimony as fiction, racists could read anti-racist literature as supporting their views, and misogynists could claim feminist texts actually proved women's inferiority. Without some constraint on interpretation, how could we prevent malicious readings? New critics had tried to ground interpretation in textual properties, but reader response critics showed those properties were also interpretively constructed. This led to the crisis of interpretive authority that has defined criticism ever since. The death of the author also enabled a disturbing separation between art and ethics. If authors' beliefs and actions didn't matter for interpreting their work, then could we enjoy literature by terrible people? Could we read Ezra Pound's poetry while ignoring his fascism and anti-Semitism? Could we watch Roman Polanski films while forgetting his sexual assault conviction? The new critical position said yes, the art was separate from the artist, judge it on aesthetic grounds alone. But many critics argued this was morally bankrupt, that separating art from its creator was itself an ideological choice that served to protect powerful men from accountability. Fan culture and the death of canon. The death of the author, combined with reader response theory, provided theoretical justification for fan fiction and transformative fandom. If texts belonged to readers once published, if meanings were created through interpretation rather than fixed by authorial intent, then fans rewriting stories or imagining alternative interpretations were legitimate critical activities. Slash fiction that reimagined male characters as lovers, fix-it fics that changed disappointing endings, alternate universe stories that transplanted characters into different settings, all of this became defensible as valid reader response. Academic critics initially dismissed fan culture as lowbrow and illegitimate, but feminist scholars in the 1990s began taking it seriously as a site where mostly women readers exercised interpretive agency and creative power. Constance Penley, Camille Bacon-Smith, and Henry Jenkins wrote ethnographies of fan communities, showing that fans were engaged in sophisticated interpretive practices, not just passively consuming media. They argued that fan fiction was a form of participatory culture where readers talked back to canonical texts, challenging authorial authority and corporate ownership of stories. This created ongoing conflicts between fans and creators about who owned stories and who had the right to determine their meanings. When J.K. Rowling announced that Dumbledore was gay, some fans celebrated, while others rejected it as retroactive canonization that didn't count. When she made transphobic statements, many fans declared she no longer had authority over Harry Potter's meaning, that the stories now belonged to the community and could be read against her bigotry. This was the death of the author playing out in real time, with communities claiming interpretive sovereignty over texts regardless of creators' intentions. The same dynamics played out around canonical literature. Feminist critics reread classic novels to find proto-feminist themes. Queer critics found same-sex desire in canonical texts. Post-colonial critics read back against imperialist narratives. Each approach claimed that textual meanings exceeded or contradicted what authors consciously intended, that literature contained resources for critique that authors hadn't recognized.
This made the canon simultaneously more open. Anyone could find their concerns represented through creative reading, and more contested. Every interpretation was political and none were neutral. Why this still dominates every internet argument? Every debate about what a movie or book or TV show really means is a battle over whether authorial intent matters. When fans argue that their interpretation is valid even though the creator says otherwise, they're invoking death of the author. When critics analyze how texts perpetuate harmful ideologies, even when creators claim progressive intent, they're using new critical and structuralist techniques to read against authorial authority. When people say that's just your interpretation to dismiss readings they don't like, they're invoking reader response theory, whether they know it or not. The death of the author gave us our modern interpretive chaos, where every reading claims equal legitimacy. Film theory YouTube channels explaining the real meaning hidden in popular movies, English teachers insisting blue curtains symbolize depression, fans writing manifestos about why their ships are canon regardless of what happens on screen. All of this stems from mid-20th century critical theory declaring that texts mean whatever competent interpreters can persuasively argue they mean. We live in the aftermath of the author, and no one has figured out who's actually in charge now. New criticism's close reading techniques still dominate how literature is taught, even though its theoretical premises have been mostly abandoned. Students learn to analyze imagery, symbols, irony, and paradox because those skills are teachable and testable. But the new critical claim that those techniques revealed objective meanings has been replaced by recognition that interpretation is always perspectival and political. We use new critical methods to reach non-new critical conclusions, finding in texts the ideologies, power structures, and cultural assumptions that new critics tried to ignore by focusing purely on form. The real legacy of killing the author is that criticism became democratic and contested. No one has final authority over meaning, not authors, not professional critics, not academic institutions. This is liberating because it means literature belongs to everyone who reads it, that you don't need credentials to interpret and argue about texts. But it's also destabilizing because it means there's no way to resolve interpretive disputes definitively, no court of appeal beyond what interpretive communities find persuasive. We killed the author and discovered we couldn't agree on who inherited the estate. Deconstruct button. Jacques Derrida introduced deconstruction to literary criticism in the late 1960s, and it exploded like a bomb in the academy. Derrida argued that Western philosophy since Plato had been based on a series of binary oppositions where one term was privileged over the other: presence over absence, speech over writing, meaning over signifier, reality over representation. These hierarchies seemed natural and inevitable, but Derrida showed they were actually constructed and unstable. Every text, if read carefully enough, contained the resources for its own undoing, moments where the privileged terms depended on the supposedly inferior terms they excluded.
Derrida's reading method involved finding these moments of aporia, places where texts contradicted their own logic or where the excluded term returned to haunt the system. He showed that Plato's privileging of speech over writing in Phaedrus actually relied on metaphors of writing to describe memory and thought. That Rousseau's celebration of natural presence depended on supplementary systems like language and culture that supposedly corrupted presence. Derrida wasn't saying these texts were wrong or bad, he was showing that they were more complex and contradictory than they appeared. That meaning was never simply present, but always deferred, always referring to other signs in endless chains of signification. Applied to literary criticism, deconstruction meant reading texts to show how they undermined their own apparent meanings. J. Hillis Miller, Paul de Man, and other Yale critics brought Derrida's methods to American literary studies, producing readings that demonstrated how literary works were always already aware of their own fictiveness and unreliability. They showed that texts dramatized the impossibility of stable meaning, that literature was fundamentally ironic and self-subverting. This made literature valuable precisely because it revealed the instability of language and meaning that philosophy tried to deny. Paul de Man's essays collected in Blindness and Insight in 1971 argued that critics were most insightful when they were blind to their own method's limitations, that the best readings emerged from productive misreadings. He analyzed Romantic poets and showed that their claims about imagination and presence actually demonstrated the opposite, that language was always figural and meaning was always deferred. De Man's work was brilliant but also deeply pessimistic, suggesting that literature ultimately revealed only the impossibility of what it tried to achieve. After his death, revelations about his youthful anti-Semitic journalism in Nazi-occupied Belgium created a scandal that many felt discredited deconstruction by association. Post-structuralism: everything is text, nothing is truth. Michel Foucault revolutionized how critics understood the relationship between knowledge and power. In works like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality, Foucault argued that what counted as truth in any period was produced through power relations, that knowledge and power were inseparable. Literature wasn't an escape from power, but a site where power operated, where discourses constructed subjects and normalized behaviors. Foucault showed that the modern concepts of the author, the creative genius, the literary canon were historically specific inventions that served particular power interests. Foucault's essay What is an Author in 1969 complicated Barthes' Death of the Author by historicizing the author function. The author wasn't a natural category, but a juridical and economic construct that emerged to regulate discourses, to assign ownership and responsibility for texts. Different periods and cultures had different author functions with different powers and constraints. This meant killing the author didn't simply liberate texts, but raised questions about what regulatory functions would replace authorial authority. Foucault was less interested in interpreting texts than in analyzing how discursive formations made certain statements possible and excluded others. Jean Baudrillard took postmodernism to its extreme by arguing that contemporary culture had become a world of simulations with no relationship to reality. In Simulacra and Simulation in 1981, Baudrillard claimed that media and consumer culture had created a hyper-reality where images and signs replaced the real, where Disneyland was more real than America and TV more real than lived experience. Literature and art in this context couldn't represent reality because there was no reality separate from representation to represent. Everything was simulacrum, copies without originals, surfaces without depth. This made traditional literary criticism obsolete because it assumed literature represented or expressed something real. If everything was simulation, then criticism should analyze how simulations worked, how they seduced viewers, how they created effects of reality without reference to any actual reality.
Baudrillard's work was more philosophical provocation than practical criticism, but it captured something about postmodern culture's sense that everything was mediated, that authenticity was impossible, that we lived in a world of screens and surfaces with no depth behind them. The politics of postmodernism. Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism in 1991, analyzed postmodernism as the cultural expression of a new phase of capitalism. Jameson argued that postmodern art's fragmentation, pastiche, loss of historical depth, and celebration of surfaces reflected the globalized consumer capitalism that emerged after World War II. Postmodernism wasn't just an aesthetic style, but a whole cultural condition where capitalism had colonized every aspect of life, where even rebellion and critique were instantly commodified and marketed. Jameson's Marxist analysis made postmodernism seem less like liberation and more like ideological trap. If postmodern culture taught that grand narratives were dead, that might prevent people from imagining alternatives to capitalism. If everything was surface and simulation, that might preclude critique based on exposing reality behind appearances. Jameson wanted to historicize and critique postmodernism rather than simply celebrate it, to show how it served capitalist ideology while appearing to be subversive and playful. Linda Hutcheon defended postmodernism from different political angles in A Poetics of Postmodernism in 1988, arguing that postmodern art was inherently political because it denaturalized dominant representations. By showing that everything was constructed, that history was narrated from perspectives, that truths were plural and contested, postmodern art opened space for counter-narratives and marginalized voices. Hutcheon coined the term historiographic metafiction for novels that simultaneously told historical stories and interrogated how history was written, making their own fictiveness visible while engaging seriously with historical questions. Postmodern techniques like pastiche, irony, metafiction, and intertextuality could be used conservatively to suggest everything was meaningless or progressively to challenge dominant narratives. Postmodernism's politics depended on how it was deployed and interpreted. Hutcheon argued that postmodern art at its best was complicitous critique, simultaneously participating in the systems it criticized and exposing their constructed nature. This made postmodernism ambiguous and unstable, capable of being recuperated by the forces it appeared to challenge. Identity politics and postmodern theory. Feminist critics had complex relationships with postmodernism. Judith Butler's Gender Trouble in 1990 used post-structuralist theory to argue that gender was performative, produced through repeated stylized acts rather than expressing some essential identity. Butler showed that what seemed most natural and biological about gender was actually cultural construction. This was politically powerful because it meant gender norms could be subverted, that drag and gender parody revealed the artificiality of all gender performance. Butler's theory became foundational for queer theory and transgender studies. But other feminists worried that postmodernism's rejection of stable categories and essential identities undermined feminist politics. If woman was just a constructed category with no essence, how could feminists organize politically around women's oppression? If all identity claims were equally fictional, didn't that erase the material realities of sexism and violence?
Nancy Hartstock asked, why has the category of woman become unstable at precisely the moment when women are organizing politically, suggesting that postmodern theory might serve conservative ends by fragmenting feminist solidarity? Critical race theorists and post-colonial critics had similar ambivalences. Post-colonial theory emerged partly from post-structuralism, using its tools to analyze how colonial discourse constructed the colonized as other and how post-colonial literature wrote back against those representations. Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978 combined Foucauldian discourse analysis with literary criticism to show how Western representations of the Orient created the colonial other as exotic, inferior, and available for domination. Said's work demonstrated that literature wasn't innocent representation, but an instrument of imperial power. Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak developed sophisticated post-colonial theories using deconstruction and psychoanalysis. Bhabha's concepts of hybridity and mimicry showed how colonial subjects disrupted colonial authority by imperfectly copying it. Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, questioned whether post-colonial intellectuals could represent the experiences of the truly marginalized, or whether their theoretical sophistication silenced the voices they claimed to champion. These theorists showed that postmodern theory could be adapted for anti-colonial and anti-racist critique, but debates continued about whether its skepticism toward identity and political commitment was enabling or disabling. The culture wars and theory backlash. Postmodern theory became a battleground in the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. Conservative critics like Roger Kimball and Dinesh D'Souza attacked postmodernism as nihilistic relativism that destroyed traditional values and Western civilization. They claimed that deconstruction and post-structuralism were obscurantist jargon designed to intimidate readers, and that postmodern critics were political ideologues using theory to push radical agendas. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind in 1987 blamed postmodern relativism for students' supposed intellectual and moral decline. The Sokal hoax in 1996 crystallized these tensions. Physicist Alan Sokal submitted a parody article filled with postmodern jargon to the cultural studies journal Social Text, and it was published. Sokal then revealed it was deliberately nonsensical, arguing that postmodern humanities scholarship had become so divorced from reality and standards of evidence that it couldn't distinguish meaningful claims from gibberish. Postmodern theorists responded that Sokal had misunderstood their project, that they weren't making empirical claims but analyzing discourses and representations. These debates revealed genuine problems with how postmodern theory was being used in literary criticism. Some critics did hide behind jargon and obscurity, making simple points incomprehensible through theoretical apparatus. Some applications of theory were mechanical and reductive, finding the same thing in every text regardless of its specificity. Some theorists did seem to celebrate meaninglessness and confusion when it was really just confusing. The backlash against theory was partly reactionary defensive tradition, but it was also responding to real excesses and failures. Yet the attacks on postmodern theory often deliberately misrepresented it. Critics like Camille Paglia and Harold Bloom claimed that post-structuralism destroyed aesthetic value and literary beauty by reducing everything to politics. But postmodern critics weren't arguing that beauty didn't exist, they were analyzing how aesthetic judgments were culturally constructed and how they reinforced power relations. Recognizing that great literature often meant literature by white men about white men didn't mean you couldn't enjoy Shakespeare. It meant understanding that canons were political, not natural. Postmodernism permanently changed how we think about representation, meaning, and interpretation. The idea that language transparently represents reality, that texts have definite meanings, that criticism discovers truth, all of that became impossible to maintain after post-structuralism.
Even critics who rejected postmodernism had to engage with its challenges to explain why they still believed in stable meanings or objective interpretations despite postmodern skepticism. You couldn't go back to naive realism after Derrida and Foucault. Postmodernism also made criticism self-conscious about its own methods and assumptions. Critics became aware that their interpretations weren't neutral discoveries, but interventions shaped by theoretical frameworks and political commitments. This could lead to productive reflexivity, where critics acknowledged their positions and interests. It could also lead to paralyzing self-consciousness, where critics spent more time discussing methodology than actually reading texts. The best postmodern criticism managed to be both theoretically sophisticated and attentive to literature specificity, but a lot of it got lost in abstraction. The postmodern emphasis on constructedness and contingency opened space for marginalized voices and counter-narratives. If dominant meanings weren't natural but constructed, they could be deconstructed and reconstructed differently. Feminist, queer, critical race, and post-colonial critics used postmodern tools to challenge canonical interpretations and recover suppressed perspectives. This was genuinely democratizing, showing that the Western literary canon's universality was actually parochial and exclusionary, that other traditions had equal claims to value. But postmodernism's rejection of truth and foundations also created problems for political critique and collective action. If all narratives were equally constructed and partial, how could you argue that some were better than others? If meaning was always unstable and indeterminate, how could you make definitive political claims? If identity was purely performative, what grounded solidarity and shared struggle? These tensions between postmodern theory and progressive politics have never been fully resolved, and contemporary criticism still struggles with how to be both theoretically sophisticated and politically effective. We live in a postmodern world whether we like it or not. The sense that everything is mediated, that authenticity is impossible, that images and simulations have replaced reality, that grand narratives of progress and enlightenment have collapsed, all of this characterizes contemporary culture. Social media is the ultimate postmodern space, where identity is performed, reality is curated, and everything is surface. Postmodern criticism prepared us to understand this world, even if it couldn't tell us how to change it. The irony is that postmodernism predicted our current conditions so accurately that it seems less like critique and more like prophecy.